Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and with me today is Father John. How are we doing, Father John?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Doing good, thank God. And man, the fallout of the last show, to be honest, I took it personally because it was so unexpected. I thought we were really nice and really tried our best to kind of do the same format like we did last time. We'll get into that a little more, but I'm wondering, did anyone from your parish, anyone talk to you about that show?
I've had a few people mention it, but I can't remember anything specific that they said. I think they mentioned like an item that was brought up here or there, but it wasn't a strong reaction.
There goes a forgettable show, I suppose. Now, this was a tough show for me to name, and I just called it, for the sake of simplicity, why I am not, in quotation marks, true Orthodox. Because, of course, if you're an Orthodox Christian, you want to say you're not true or you're not genuine. What we're saying is why we are not amongst the group that identifies by the specific name, true Orthodox. And I think I made even a little disclaimer, which we'll get into. And I just want to remind people, if programming like this is a blessing to you, subscribe to Father John's channel, which is below. He's so close to 1,000 subscribers. I checked the other day. You might even be there. I'm not sure, Father John. You're smiling. Have you hit 1,000 yet?
I don't think we've hit it yet, but I haven't checked it recently.
Now listen, stop what you're doing. Not you, Father John, the viewer. Stop what you're doing. Subscribe to Father John's channel. It's below. Why? So that way they can use an iPhone to live stream. It just makes it easier for them. It's a practical thing for his church. The channel also has Bible studies and other cool stuff that Father John, if I'm not taking up all his time, will, I'm sure, branch out into. So please subscribe to Father John's channel. I mean, we've been saying this for a few years, so I'm not doing a very good job. But hopefully tonight we will get people and we'll remind people, subscribe to Father John's channel. Also, if this work is a blessing to you, support the missionary work in Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. I'll be leaving for Cambodia in 2 or 3 weeks, February 6th. And so we'll be getting some more updates in the ground when I'm there, and doing work and all the fun stuff that I do when I do my trips to Cambodia. But please support the mission there. Now, we had a little disclaimer, and so you took offense to this, so please correct me, Father John. But I'm just going to use myself, maybe not Father John, the terms World Orthodox, meaning the communion of canonically regular churches, and true Orthodox, meaning canonically irregular churches who separate communion over Orthodox doctrines. These are imperfect names, so don't get offended. You know, this is like sticks and stones, right? So, like, lack of a better term, I'm just going to use it. Lack of a shorter term, I'm just going to use it. But because of sticks and stones, Father John prefers another term. He could, by all means, use it. I just want people to know, because of their use, World Orthodox jurisdictions, they don't necessarily deny being true or genuine, right? So, like, just because we're using the term World Orthodox to mean they're not true, and true Orthodox jurisdictions assert their Catholicity and canonical order. So I might be using, and I will be justifying the usage of the term canonically irregular in a sense that I don't think is actually even a pejorative, but that is not terminology they use. So should just be aware of it. I just want to be upfront. Again, sticks and stones rule. Don't cry about it. Be a big boy. So I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add to that, Father John.
Well, my preferred term would, instead of World Orthodox, I would prefer talking about the mainstream Orthodox, because, you know, I think that they use World Orthodox as a pejorative, you know, not in any kind of a just merely descriptive way.
Well, that's you could call it mainstream Orthodox. So the way we're going to start here is I'm going to give Father John the floor. He was attacked considerably on Twitter and elsewhere, really for, I feel, no good reason. I don't think Father John was anything but a gentleman in the last show. It's a shame for those who aren't Orthodox to see that, you know, in kind of these in-family disputes, sometimes it gets very personal and passionate. my favorite insult of Father John is that he's a sweet old man with a white beard, and he draws you in with his voice and his very trustworthy demeanor, and then only I kind of stick the knife in. I think I had the knife part, but that's a good paraphrase of what the allegation of Father John trying to trick you with his affable self. So that being said, Father John, I think there's a lot of things you didn't really get to say last time due to the format. And I wanted to give you the opportunity before I give a defense of the format and everything else today for you to speak about what's on your mind, and we'll kind of spitball the conversation from there. So, Father John, what do you feel you didn't get to cover in the previous show that you feel the audience should be aware when it comes to this divide between ROCOR and the true Orthodox?
Well, one example, I'm actually intending to try to write this as a blog post, maybe tonight or tomorrow, but if not, next week. But Father Joseph brought up the question of my motivations for taking the positions that I've taken, and suggested that it was because I felt isolated here in Texas, even though at the time there were two Metropolitan Kyanos parishes in the Houston area that we were in communion with. As a matter of fact, before I was made a priest and before we got a blessing to start our own parish, there was a period of about 6 months that I was serving at one of these parishes. Neither one of these parishes exist anymore. And I'll get into why that is. But there was a parish dedicated to St. John of Shanghai, as a matter of fact, in Cut and Shoot, Texas, which is a real place. And long story, it had something to do with a Baptist fight or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, those 6 months that I was serving with that parish, I mean, they were good people, but I did get to see how that synod was operating on the ground, and there were a lot of things that struck me as being odd. And
well, you've called it squirrely,
yeah,
which could have very negative connotations, but also could be a very charitable way to put it if things are really nuts. So how could you just explain what was going on that you weren't comfortable with?
Well, I mean, my interactions with the people who were part of the Kyanos Synod went back a number of years prior to this. So when I was ordained a deacon, I remember one of the priests, and I don't want to, if they see this, I don't want them to think that I think that they're bad people. I actually learned a lot from the priest that was here originally was Father David County, and he eventually moved to Etna, and I learned a lot from him. But I remember when I was ordained a deacon that he gave me a talking to about, well, you should wear a cassock everywhere you go, and you should also get a sleeping rasa. And he was actually offering to have the nuns in Etna make me a sleeping rasa. Well, I'd never heard of a sleeping rasa prior to Father David telling me that, and I asked some senior Russian priest about this, and they laughed. They'd never heard of it either. And I think it's a bit extreme. And they actually, if the priest was ever seen in any context, including his own house, without wearing a cassock, it was seen to be some major transgression. Now, on the one hand, that did influence me to want to wear my cassock when I'm out in public. Now, the exceptions to that are if I'm mowing my grass, I don't wear my cassock because I don't want to tear up my cassock. And if I'm out walking in the morning, I also don't want to wear a cassock just because I don't want to tear it up. And I only have so many. And often it's like this time of year it's cold, so I'm wearing winter wear to keep from freezing. But it did influence me to appreciate the fact that clergy should be identifiably clergy when they're out in public. And I, for example, when I fly, I'm wearing a cassock, and I've had many conversations with people, sometimes Orthodox, sometimes not, but they know I'm a priest. And so if it hadn't been, if I had not known Father David and he had not, said these kinds of things to me, I might not have been as consistent with it as I have been. I think it was a good thing. But I think they took it a bit far.
So it kind of called you to task. You took something positive from it. And but
right.
In your own discernment, you feel there's some things that are too far.
Right. I mean, there's lots of kind of drama kind of things that I could get into, but just one example of something that is very strange to me is at the parish in Cut and Shoot. I remember Holy Week was coming up, and I asked the priest, when is this service going to be? I can't even remember what service it was, but it was a service during Holy Week that we do every year. And the response that I got was, well, I'll have to call Father Akakios and find out. Well, Father Akakios is or at least was the abbot of the monastery in Etna.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't make any sense that a parish priest would have to contact an abbot of a monastery to find out at what time they will do Holy Week services, because we do them every year. They don't change unless Annunciation happens to come into the equation some kind of way. And so it was just there was a lot of micromanaging that was going on. And another thing that I did observe, without getting into the details, is if they felt threatened, even when there were people who were not actually doing it, but if they felt like someone might say bad things about them, they would preemptively start attacking them and suggesting that they were mentally ill. And so there was an atmosphere that you could say had some cult-like aspects to it. That basically,
or at the very least, a lot of negativity, right? A lot of jumping these very negative conclusions.
Yeah, and the thing is, like I said, these people were very sincere. As a matter of fact, the priest in Cut and Shoot, when I met him, he was actually an Antiochian deacon. I was a ROCOR deacon. And I remember having them over at my house and showing them the videos of, that were put out about the ecumenical movement by the Kyanos Synod, which I thought did a good job of exposing what was going on. And so I probably had a fairly sizable role in encouraging him to go in the direction that he did, because he wound up leaving without a release and coming into that synod. And but he had a job when he came into that synod working at a hospital. He was able to support his family with it. But Metropolitan Chrysostomos had the policy that you had to wear a cassock even if you were at work. Well, his job found an excuse to fire him at some point or lay him off, because he was like a public relations person, and he was going around in a cassock and wearing, a scoufia or whatever that they call it, a scoufos, I guess. And so they fired him. He wound up having to do construction work, which was very difficult. He was out in the sun. It wound up having a very bad effect on his health. And another thing that Archbishop Chrysostomos had a policy on is he would not allow his parishes to have services in a storefront or in any temporary kind of a setting. So both parishes, the priest built a chapel on their property. And that's the reason why both parishes are gone, because for different reasons, both priests had to move away. Well, when they had to move away, there wasn't anybody else with the money to step in and say, okay, well, I'll buy your property so we can keep this parish open. And as a result, both parishes disappeared. And so that's a level of rigorism over something that's really not that important that inhibits missionary work.
And I mean, and this is personal stuff. And so I don't want people to think that, look at Father John saying all these anecdotes to say, everyone's bad. But you're saying your interactions, where you lived, were these negative things you're seeing. And
let me get back to the whole motivations thing, because.
Well, can I make one comment before
you
say that? And the comment was, I was very surprised based on the positive collaboration you've already had with Father Joseph, that it went negative so fast. I'm
tempted to speculate on that. It's probably better not to do it. I've known Father Joseph since he was a layman. I've never met him in person. It's all been online and by phone. But I've always had good interactions with him, and I hope that it stays that way. I'll just leave it at that.
And so you're saying about the negative interpretations of your motivations.
Right. So what I'm intending to write in my article is my motivation. I mean, my positions really haven't changed over the years very much. There was one area that I would say my opinions did change, and that's there was a time when I thought that the calendar by itself was a legitimate basis for separating from a bishop. And I did that basically on the basis of the Sigillian that anathematized the new calendar. And I found out back in the 90s at some point, interacting with Father Dimitri Cosby of the OCA, who, you know, he was a scholar on some level. I can't remember his credentials, but he had an above average education. And he was just laying out the evidence that this was a forgery. Later, there's now an article by Metropolitan Kyprianos of the old calendar group that I mentioned, no less, that also argues that it was a forgery. So basically being presented with evidence.
We'll touch on that, by the way. Yeah. We'll touch on some of the details.
But you know, being presented with evidence that disproved my position, I modified my position, which is, I think, is not an unreasonable thing to do. Well, other than that, though, my position
it wasn't loneliness. What you're saying, right. You just became intellectually convinced of certain things.
What did motivate me is the same thing that motivated me to speak out about ecumenism. If you go to the orthodoxinfo.com site and you go to the introduction to the ecumenism section, you'll find there's a quote by a certain Deacon John Whiteford. Well, that's the same me back in the 1990s when I was a deacon, talking about why I was opposed to ecumenism. And the reason is very simple, and that's that when I discovered Orthodoxy, to me, it was discovering this great treasure that brought me what I was looking for. I knew that there was something missing in my experience of Christianity up until that point. When I found Orthodox, I thought, man, this is it. Bonanza, Eureka. Well, I'm talking to everybody who will listen practically about the Orthodox faith when I have an opportunity to do it. And I had several experiences very early on where I would talk to somebody about Orthodoxy and explain to them what we believe. And they would say, Orthodox don't believe they're the true church. I was at this ecumenical gathering and, you know, they were there just participating along with everybody else. So how can you say the Orthodox believe they're the only church? And so I was opposed to ecumenism and still am opposed to ecumenism because it is a barrier to the Orthodox Church. It gives people a false sense of security. And besides the fact that it's a violation of the canons in terms of having joint prayer and that sort of thing. And it's also ecumenism itself as a teaching is a heresy.
Yes, but you're okay with a little bit of Sergianism?
Sergianism is a sin, and I'm not okay with it either. But and that's another thing we can get into later, because I never really had thought about the whole question about whether Sergianism was a heresy or not, at least not on any deep level. But I think what I was able to find after the fact verified the fact that ROCOR never called it a heresy. But
we have, I just wanted to shout out to Father Ambrose. He's apparently in Trinidad right now. He's generally in Granada. So just great to have you on, Father.
I had Father Ambrose in my house when he got stranded at Bush Intercontinental Airport one time. So it was kind of nice to get to know him.
He's very tall. I think a height requirement for monks.
When I became Orthodox, another thing that I discovered very early on was this whole mess of having what I would call Vagante groups, which I wouldn't call the old calendar groups Vagante, but Vagante groups are like, very often it's like some old Catholic bishop with a squirrely history that may not even the old Catholics even recognize, but they basically will present themselves as being Orthodox and they fool people. But also you have these old calendar groups that cause a lot of problems. And I converted in 1990. My godfather, not very long after I was baptized, wound up getting sucked into the Panalamanite schism, which the Hakna, as they call themselves, they still exist, although they're reduced in size. But they went into schism from ROCOR in 1986 because Metropolitan Vitali was a modernist and ecumenist all of a sudden, even though prior to Father Pantaleimon being accused of being a sexual predator and sodomizing novices at his monastery, he was saying the ROCOR was the last bastion of true Orthodoxy. But suddenly, when he was being accused by people, and eventually it got up to like 20 people, novices and monks from his monastery, that accused him of the same thing. That's why so at some point you have to start saying it's not just slander when you have 20 people that you
Well, but
cases
has he
contrary to
ever
the
been
schema.
convicted though?
Well, he later admitted it before he died. So it's not even a question anymore.
All right.
And that's why a lot of people who were part of Hockna left and wound up under the more mainstream Greek old calendarists. They're under now, I guess it's Archbishop Dimitri or Demetrios. But so anyway, my godfather winds up with this group, and I had this. He's telling me you should leave too. And so I had suddenly had to start digging into this whole question. And there were other old calendar groups or, like I said, Vagante groups that I would hear my priest talk about. And I remember asking him at one point, when I was a Nazarene, I never met a person that claimed to be a Nazarene that wasn't. There was no fake Nazarene clergy running around. So why do you have that in the Orthodox Church? And he didn't give me an answer right away. Maybe it was a week later or something like that. But he said, I've been thinking about your question. Here's the answer. If you're a Protestant and you want to do your own thing, you can just go start your own church. You can start a new denomination. So you don't have to be a fake Nazarene. You can just start, the Church of the Fire Baptized, Pillar of Fire or whatever. You just come up with a name that sounds catchy and you can start your own church. But in the Orthodox Church, if you don't want to submit to authority and you want to do your own thing, you have to do these kinds of fake things or go into schism to be able to do your own thing. And I'm not saying that that's true of all the old calendarists. I think in most cases that's probably not true, but I think it is true in some cases. People not wanting to submit to authority and wanting to do their own thing. And these things are confusing to people because when you talk to people about Orthodoxy, and if they're aware of the fact that these different groups exist, they'll start pointing to these things. Look, you people are not united. Look, you got this schism here and that schism there. And these are all things that keep people from embracing the faith because it's confusing to people. And so I had to very early on discover why the Hockna people were not right. And I have pages of articles countering Hockna claims that go back to before I was a priest. And then I have articles that I put on there back when we started having schisms inside of ROCOR. Because one thing about the Greek Old Calendar history that's, I think, important to understand is there were two periods of time where ROCOR entered into a formal communion with a Greek Old Calendar group. In both cases, it did not last long. And that's because on the front end, people thought, well, these people see things the same way that we do. But then we started, as we got into these relationships with these groups, we started to realize, what, they really don't have the same views that we have. They've got a different way of looking at it, a different way of approaching it. And also their propensity to break into new schisms was particularly shocking to people in ROCOR, because ROCOR had always been able to hold it together. Well, of course, you have the OCA and the Evlogians. I mean, even ROCOR had some schisms in its history, but for the most part, we didn't have people just flying off in different directions all the time. And I think a lot of people thought that maybe it was some sort of a genetic flaw that Greek people had. But then in the 1990s, you started having breakaway people from ROCOR, because what happened is in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And so the thing that was keeping everybody in ROCOR on the same page was, okay, the Soviet Union still exists, and we cannot submit to the Moscow Patriarchate while the Soviet Union is still in power and has the ability to use the Moscow Patriarchate to manipulate us. That everybody agreed with that. What everybody didn't agree with, there were people who thought the Moscow Patriarchate had no grace. And there were people who adamantly believed that they did have grace. And there were various nuances in between those two poles. But we all knew, okay, well, until the Soviet Union collapses or it comes to an end, we can't do it. I mean, there's a lot would have to change before we can start talking to the Moscow Patriarchate. And I think people thought that day would never come. I mean, I never thought I'd live to see the Soviet Union collapse. But boom, it happened. It happened in 1991. And then I think for a couple of years, people were content to just let that ride. Okay, well, it's going to take some time. We need to make sure that, that this freedom the church is experiencing is not just some temporary blip on the radar screen. But around 1998, Metropolitan Vitale, who at that time was beginning to suffer from dementia, and this is it's not speculation, because even the people who objected to people talking about that later on claimed the same thing when he was being manipulated to say things they didn't like. And so in 1998, the Synod had met and it issued a statement. And then right after the statement had been issued, and I can't even remember the details of it, but it was sort of a moderate statement about the Moscow Patriarchate that thought that there was, that certainly did not condemn them, and was expressing some hope that we would be able to, eventually talk and work things out. Well, then he issued, at least under his name, there was an epistle that was issued that contradicted everything the Synod had just said. And that threw what was a Synod internal debate among the bishops into a thing that was being discussed online. I think one thing that was unexpected about all that was, in the past, you might have been able to get away with something like that because people didn't have the easy means of mass communications. It used to be, there was a time when mass communications meant that you started sending faxes to different parishes to fax documents objecting to something or other, but it was very tedious to do. All of a sudden, you had the means to express your opinion instantaneously to everybody else who was online in ROCOR, and it became sort of an open war. And unfortunately, the Indiana Orthodox list was taken down several years ago, and the archives are not available to my knowledge. If anybody knows if they are available, I'd like to know, because there are a lot of things I would have liked to have cut and pasted off of it. But the positions I was taking back then are essentially the same positions I've taken ever since. And that's that we have to work out these deals. Ecumenism's bad. The Moscow Patriarchate needs to glorify the new martyrs, etc. But we're not condemning them, because the whole purpose of ROCOR is to ride out this whole period of persecution and then come before the Russian Church and give an answer to its activities in the meantime. And this period of time when we were essentially, for practical purposes, independent. Although we always said we are part of the Russian Church. We're not independent. There will be reconciliation when the Soviet power comes to an end. That's in the charter of ROCOR, if I remember correctly. And so my positions haven't changed. I just want people to become Orthodox, and that's always been my desire. And I've always been my desire has been to remove these obstacles. And so, just like I think it's wrong that the new calendar was introduced the way that it was introduced. I certainly think that the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Patriarch of Alexandria have done a lot of things that are objectionable. And there are things that the Antiochian Patriarchate has done that I'm not a big fan of too. But that doesn't mean that we, pull up the drawbridge and start preparing the boiling pitch and go to war with the entirety of the rest of the church, just because there are some parts of it that have some serious issues. So that's my motivation, is I want people to become Orthodox, because that's where the truth is.
Father John, before I get into my prepared notes, do you have some talking points you want to go through, or you want to do them interdispersed with the PowerPoint we have?
Yeah, we can just start going through your PowerPoint, and as things pop up, we can talk about them.
Excellent. All right. So we're going to now bring that on screen, and we get smaller. Sorry about that, guys. And so before I get started, I want to make an apology. All right. And it's an apology for the format, which I've been doing for more than half a decade now, which is getting kind of scary. How long? Like, I'm a YouTuber. I didn't even really set out to be a YouTuber, but we've been doing these videos for a long time. You're one of the first ones, Father John, on the Formula Hormistas, I think it was. But it's one of the formats I've had in this channel for a long time, is having multiple views represented. And it's sort of between a roundtable and debate, where I ask these purposely kind of tough questions, but not too tough, to both sides, and kind of tease out the opinion there. And so this is not the show we had together last time. Wasn't like the first time this was ever done, or a format that should have surprised anyone. For example, Father John and Father Joseph's first collaboration was precisely that sort of format. I had a show called Nicaea 25, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox Communion episode, which also included Father Joseph. There's others, but I just bring these up because it's not the first time we've had this format. I stand behind the format because I think it's a useful way to bring out information. And the idea is to prevent the sort of debate antics where then it gets into people trying to just own each other or call each other names, which then really shuts down conversation, prevents information from being disseminated. Now, so this is exactly what we're trying to do, and everything went, I'd say, relatively fine. I think there were some comments made that required me to maybe interject once or twice, but generally things were fine until Father Peter came on. And Father Peter was to come on to hash out this kind of his alleged view that he doesn't listen to the consensus fathers, he just listens to modern Athonite elders. It's a kind of insult that was restated during the show and by commenters. So I figured bring him on to talk about it for 5 minutes. That'd be fun. Didn't know he would stay or that it would be demanded that he would stay. And maybe that's a little naive of me, but that's essentially what occurred. But Father Peter wasn't there to debate or even defend world orthodoxy. He was there to talk about that one notion, and then he kept being asked about topics that were relevant to the rest of the conversation. So this sort of idea that it was unfair to bring Father Peter on, it was unfair actually to kind of rope him into it, because that really wasn't why he was on. But that being said, like
just for the record, so that people understand what happened, you can go back and look at the video, but you actually had taken Father Peter off. And Father Joseph said, bring him back on. And he later said, well, I didn't want to say take him off because it would look like I didn't want to talk to him. Well, all he had to do was not say anything after you took him off, and we could have gone on with the discussion as we had originally planned. And literally, if you look at what happened after that, the only person that got short shrift after that was me. And I'm not complaining about it, but we were trying to be fair, and we didn't want to have Father Peter get equal time with Father Joseph and maybe get equal time with Father Joseph and essentially have two people against one with 2/3 of the time. It obviously would not appear to be fair. And so I think we went out of our way to try to be fair.
And as it comes, Father John was gracious to hold back during the exchange, not to try to dogpile Father Joseph. And I noticed that too. A few times I purposely tried to get you in there because it makes me look like a terrible host, right? I have you on. It's like, oh, look, the more famous priest comes on. We don't need Father Joseph anymore. That makes me look terrible, right? That's the God's honest truth. And so it just unfolded in this unplanned direction. And it made me kind of feel like a host of a Christmas party, right? Try to have a good time with neighbors. They don't agree on everything, but you're trying to keep it light. And these two neighbors start getting to a little something. So let's just hash this out. And they seem to. Right, like, so I actually thought, man, look, I even said so. This is one of those weird things where the receipts are public and you could watch it with your own eyes. And this is no conspiracy here because you watch the whole thing unfold live. And so it looks like it was all hashed out. And as you point out, I even take Father Peter off the air. Like, hashed out, we're done. Maybe I'll keep him in the background. We could bring it back for Q&A or something. I thought he was done. I thought that was it. And then one of the neighbors started picking fights. I mean, that's what happens. He kept demanding questions of him. I remember once because I tried to lay clues as the moderator, I said, you can't get the last word if you keep demanding someone to answer your points. I'm trying to give you the opportunity to have the last word. And so one of the guests tried to keep picking fights, and I tried to keep breaking up these fights and keep them civil. And I'm accused of like speaking over or fighting with him when it really wasn't the case, and anyone could watch the video find otherwise. And so honestly, afterwards, I wasn't completely happy how it unfolded, but I tried brushing off, go, well, you know what? We still got a lot of stuff covered. And as long as we can all walk away from this and have, and feel like, you know what, at least we got a lot of stuff covered and, and let bygones be bygones, we could brush it off and have it be a positive. And, it seems that just, the side that happens to have so many schisms all the time is the same side that got all self-righteous about this and couldn't try to look at this in the most positive way, which is really what we tried setting out to do and we have done on this channel before. Now, that doesn't mean I'm perfect. I try my best. And so knowing how it unfolded now, I would not. If she said, "I want to speak to Father Peter," I would have said, "No, you can speak to him afterwards if you want to. We got to go back to our scheduled programming." But again, hindsight's 2020.
And you also didn't plan on my internet crapping out on me, and that's the reason why you brought him on. I was as surprised as Father Joseph was when I got back on that Father Peter was there, and when I later watched the video, it was kind of funny when he popped in. I was surprised
when he dropped out. I looked down, and there he was. I didn't even know he was there. So he happened to click the link at the same time he dropped out.
Okay.
But it's for those like, well, you should have anticipated it would unfold this way. I've had a very good history with this format with Father Joseph. He's been at least 2 shows that followed this format. I've spoken privately at length with Father Joseph over years now. Personal stuff, all sorts of things. I have no reason to suspect this would be so profoundly upsetting. It just shows you, it's like, you know what it is, Father? You've probably seen enough. You've taken enough confessions over the decades too. You get to the point where you don't get surprised by anything anymore. Why people do what they do and what they do. But I had no rational reason to suspect that this would be so upsetting. And so I apologize that I'm imperfect. I could have made better decisions, but I stand by the format. I have nothing more to add about it. And I ask people should presume the best because it's actually detrimental to everyone's salvation to presume the worst. There's all sorts of accusations we could be making now about those making accusations against us. And we're not. And that's why we should presume the best, presume it's just it's a misunderstanding, and one that honestly tests the limits of my, of my judgment, but I'll just presume it's a misunderstanding because of just really bad judgment. So someone here is making bad judgment, maybe me, and presuming it's a misunderstanding. Now, all that aside, let's get into the bread and butter. And just so people know, if you make insults about us or anyone else here, if I see him, being that I'm not going to be doing full-time moderation, you're going to be kicked. So please don't. Let's be respectful. Now, that being said, I want to start with, before I get into a critique, what I believe the true Orthodox are correct about. Because there's a reason why, just to say they're schism, they're ucky, they're bad about everything, they're squirrely. We get all sorts of directions about that. But there are legitimate things. And I want to bring these legitimate things to the table. These are legitimate things that ROCOR still stands for today. Now, the Council of Constantinople 1582. Now, everyone hears about the Sigillian of 1583, which, yes, is a forgery of sorts. It's made of real documents. Much of them are from Constantinopolitan councils from the era, and some of them from actually Cairo Lucaris, so shortly afterwards. These are a few decades afterwards. But it's this kind of compilation of contemporary documents, sort of like the Orthodox version of a pseudo-Isidorian decretal. But it's a combination of real documents. But the Council of Constantinople 1582 is real, just like there was the Council of Constantinople 1593. There were real councils. And we do have preserved a part of the council which bans changes to the Menaion. So it's not just to the Nicene canon on Pascha, but also makes mention of the Menaion. And we do know that both the Patriarch of Constantinople and his synod and the Patriarch of Alexandria were there. We're not aware from the extant evidence of any other synods otherwise endorsing the synod, but it does show we do have a synod, and it did teach against the change in the calendar, and it specifically also condemned change the calendar because how it would affect the Menaion. And so I just want to bring this up because a lot of the way the new calendar issue has kind of skirted around supposed liability for violating canonical precedent is like, well, we don't violate the Nicene canon, right? We the Paschalian is the way it's supposed to be. It's just everything else that's screwed up. And but we do have some precedent, conciliar precedent, that no, you can't change Menaion either. And so I would say they are on a factual basis correct. We have no reason to reject 1582 as something that's inconsistent with the Orthodox tradition. If anything, we look at local councils when we lack, let's say, a purely consensus statement to try to get an idea of what the earlier precedents are to discern what the Orthodox tradition is on a given question. Now, that being said, when the new calendar first was pretty much endorsed by the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate, it wasn't immediately accepted by everyone. It's still not accepted by half the Orthodox world. And this is what surprised me, Father John. Someone actually said to me, wait, there's canonical Orthodox jurisdictions on the old calendar? Like someone has, and like they apparently think everyone's OCA in the Greeks, and that's it. They've never seen any other church. But no, more than half the Orthodox world is still on the old calendar. And that's within the canonical world Orthodox body. Before Alexandria went into the new calendar, they had a council in 1924. The following is a quotation from the council where they say, it is not wholly accurate for your eminence, they're writing to Constantinople, to maintain that such a correction, that is to the calendar, by you would have no dogmatic or canonical impediments. Right? And so it shows you that other jurisdictions at the time would have thought the Nicene canon, or perhaps this Constantinopolitan Council in 1582, would have not allowed any modification whatsoever to the calendar. All right? So when a true Orthodox says changing the calendar was not just, imprudent, it was really wrong, you could disagree, Father. And I don't speak for a bishop or anyone else. I'm just giving my historical opinion, which is, I would say they are factually correct historically, that the change in the calendar is not justifiable with the Orthodox tradition.
Well, what I would say about it is that I don't think that a council that was essentially a local council, I don't think they declared the calendar to be, changed to be heretical. But in any case, I don't think a local council could say forever the church can never modify the calendar. I do think that
what the council taught was you can't modify the Paschalian and the Babylonian, or however you pronounce it.
Right, but it was a local council, though. It wasn't a pan-Orthodox council, and the thing of it is, it's a disciplinary question. It's not a matter of dogma, and so if you had a council that was actually representative of the entire church, and if they agreed to change the calendar, it would be something that theoretically could happen. I don't think it's going to happen, certainly not in my lifetime, but I think it's at least a theoretical possibility. But the whole purpose of a calendar, a liturgical calendar, is you want people to be celebrating feast and keeping fast together. And even after the Council of Nicaea, it took something like another 300 or more years before you got everybody on the same page. So back in Nicaea, they knew that the calendar, the Julian calendar, had a drift over time, because they actually changed the date that the equinox was calculated on, because I believe the original Julian calendar had the equinox on March the 25th. And by the time of the Council of Nicaea, it had shifted astronomically to March the 22nd. So they actually did change the date that the equinox was calculated as happening, but they didn't change the calendar as a whole. So that just affected the Paschalian, but not anything else. And it took, like I said, there was a controversy. If you ever read St. Bede's History of the People in Church of England, this was an issue in St. Bede's time, and I believe he was 7th century, if I'm remembering correctly. It might even have been 8th century, but it might have been like before his time, but close enough to his time that it was still a hot issue. He talks a lot about this whole controversy. And the Synod of Whitby, I think, was the council in Great Britain that got most people on the same page, but it still took a while for some of these people to come along entirely. So the problem is, why would you, for the sake of astronomical accuracy, then take this unity that had been achieved over centuries at great difficulty and then say, hey, let's just modify it because we want the calendar to be accurate? That doesn't make sense. So it was never a good idea, and it's certainly been very divisive and caused lots of unnecessary problems.
And apparently, the Julian calendar has certain. It depends what you base a calendar upon, but there are actually certain aspects to Julian calendar that are more accurate. And so it's,
well,
so again, it's
one of the
what you're
advantages of the
emphasizing.
Julian calendar is it repeats every 400 years, I believe. So all the cycles repeat entirely, whereas with the Gregorian calendar, it takes like more than 1,000 years for everything to repeat. And I think what you're referring to is there is scientifically, they refer to the Julian date, and that is based on the Julian calendar, and that's partly because that was the original solar calendar that was used in the Roman Empire, and it makes it a lot less complicated to talk about a date that's based on a calendar that goes back, to the beginning of when we had such a calendar, rather than
there's
making date
apparently an
shifts in the
additional
middle of the
scientific
process.
argument. There's apparently an additional scientific argument that celestially there's a sense in which it's more accurate if again your reason for measuring it's not seasonal but some other astronomical thing. I'm not a scientist.
Yeah.
But my point to say is that the consensus of saints is what's binding. So obviously a local council isn't in of itself binding, because there's all sorts of local councils, particularly in the Second Millennium Church, which aren't treated in this way. But that being said, without any contradicting councils and with follow-up Concepolitan councils that did actually have the synodical acceptance of everyone, it does, which by the way, they did not talk about the Menaion and those other councils, it does at least show this is the world that those councils are coming from, and that altering the Menaion isn't something you could do willy-nilly. It's part of the conciliar tradition of the church, even if it's not a pan-Orthodox council and is not binding in the same sense that a pan-Orthodox council is.
And basically every church that adopted the new calendar, there was something fishy about each instance, because like Meletios Metexakis was a Mason, and he actually had been defrocked by the Church of Greece because I think he venerated a Episcopal church's altar while he was vested at Amantia or something like that. And so he definitely had heretical ideas, although it's interesting that the Russian Church abroad didn't break communion with him over those things. But he wound up being run out of town on a rail after he got the Ecumenical Patriarchate to adopt the new calendar. I think the Church of Greece adopted it at the same time. And part of that was because the current government in Greece wanted everybody to switch to the new calendar because it made things easier in terms of civil matters, because then now they were in sync with the rest of the world instead of being on the Julian calendar, because basically Orthodox countries were all on the Julian calendar up until the Bolshevik Revolution and then this calendar change being introduced. But the Church in Russia, of course, kept the old calendar liturgically, but the government changed it to the Gregorian calendar after the communists took over.
Now, someone asked, I'm sorry.
Well, then Meletios Metexakis somehow manages to get elected as the Patriarch of Alexandria, because Alexandria didn't even send a representative to that council that adopted the new calendar in Constantinople. Neither did Jerusalem or Antioch. And then now all of a sudden Alexandria, which was opposed to the calendar change, suddenly adopts the calendar. And I think that was because of British influence. And the Antiochians didn't change, I think, until 1946. And if you get a copy of the Nasser 5-pounder, as it's affectionately called, the service book by Father Seraphim Nasser, if you look at the table of contents, the last thing in the book is a defense of the church calendar. But if you actually go to the end of the book, you'll find that page is not there because the Antiochians didn't modify the table of contents, but they took out that article because he was defending the old calendar.
Now, I don't know if it's true, but there's a rumor on Twitter that Patriarch Daniel of Bulgaria is floating the idea of putting Bulgaria entirely back in the old calendar. Just so people are aware, in the United States, Bulgarian Patriarchate is on the old calendar, but in Bulgaria, it's in the new calendar.
That would be wonderful if he did that. I think the Church of Poland actually did that a couple of years ago. So it'd be nice if we get a trend of people going in the right direction. They might put more pressure on the other churches to do the same.
And when they close down the OCU, then maybe they could go back to the correct calendar. But yeah, that being said, someone asked, no super chat, and we don't monetize your questions. So if I see good questions, we will star them and cover them later. If it's a bad question, I don't care how much money you donate to the Cambodian mission. We will not ask the question. But that being said, we give everyone a chance. There's no money involved. So instead of paying for play, make a donation out of the goodness of your heart to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. All right. So that being said, we talked about the calendar issue, and generally speaking, we agree. It was wrong that they changed the calendar, and we look, hopefully, that there'll be some reversal and return to the Julian calendar, at least to the point there's a pan-Orthodox council where if they really felt it was so compelling to update the Manayan and everything based upon some sort of astronomical thing, then it would do so. But it's not really, we're nowhere close to where that would be actually so compelling would have to be done.
I can't imagine a scenario in the foreseeable future where adopting a calendar change would not continue to be a divisive thing in the church.
Yeah, it wouldn't be necessary, I feel. I'd say just go back to the Julian calendar, and hopefully that brings, well, that's one less impediment for bringing back most, not all, by the way, because I think the Syriac Orthodox are the new calendar.
You sometimes hear new calendars that will say, well, in 10,000 years, you're going to be celebrating Christmas in July. Well, it's actually more like 40,000 years or something like that. They sometimes will give it some ridiculously short period of time that this change will happen. Well, it's like more than 40,000 years from now. We will be celebrating Christmas in July if we're still on the Julian calendar.
And supposedly the rotation of the Earth is actually changing in speed, and so this will affect the supposed calendar changes anyway. So this new calendar is going to become inaccurate anyhow. Right.
Well, the thing of it is if that happens, that means the people in the Southern Hemisphere will get to have Christmas in the wintertime. So it will be fair. And in another 40,000 something years, it will happen that we'll just go right back to where we were. So, hey, just hang on long enough and we'll all be on the same page again.
So we have my reasons. Again, not Father John's. And Father John could disagree. But we have my reasons for what the true Orthodox are correct about. One is I could see them saying the ROCOR didn't get their pound of meat in the Moscow Patriarchate reunion. And usually speaking, when there is a reconciliation, a legitimate one, there's generally some sort of repentance. And the MP-ROCOR reunion kind of didn't really have that for either side. There's this kind of toleration of a parallel jurisdiction because there's MP churches where there's ROCOR churches and stuff like that.
Here's the reason why I think that made sense, though, and that's that, the Russian church in the year 2000 did issue a statement in which they condemned what we were calling Sergianism. They condemned that as a okay way to govern the church when you're under persecution.
How did they condemn it, if you don't mind getting into detail?
They issued a statement on the relationship between church and state, and they said, you can do these things, but you can't do those things. Well, the things that they said you can't do are what we called Sergianism.
Got it.
And the thing is the people who were still around, and when the reconciliation happened, these were not people who you could credibly accuse of having had a hand in having people lined up and shot by the KGB. And I know Father Joseph repeatedly said that the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate were responsible for the murders of millions of people. I just haven't seen any evidence to that effect. You can show me it, and I've seen evidence of some bishops that acted in ways that were not particularly courageous, and you could even say were shameful. But I don't know of any instance of a bishop saying, "Hey, I think it'd be a good idea to go line those people up and shoot them." Or here, let me hold your coat while you go shoot them. I don't know of any situations like that. And so the thing of it is, I think it was the year 2003, but we had maybe it was 2005, but we had an all diaspora council, and at that council we had 3 representatives of the Moscow Patriarchate, including then Archimandrite but now Metropolitan Tikhon Shevchenov. And when you heard people who struggled to maintain their faith during the Soviet period, and they were facing much more difficulties than we were in freedom. It's easy to be an armchair confessor, in the United States in the safety of your mom's basement and talk about what those people should have done. But people like Metropolitan Tikhon Shevchenov, they lived through that period. They dealt with things like being threatened because of their faith and suffering persecution, and they struggled and got past that. Would it have made sense for us to demand someone like Metropolitan Tikhon Shevchenov to bow down and repent because of the sins of Metropolitan Sergius? I don't think so. I don't think that would have been a just verdict, and it would have been an unnecessary impediment to reconciliation, because I think that you could say that every part of the Russian church that broke into pieces after the Bolshevik Revolution, there's things that they did that would be capable of being criticized. And you could say that shouldn't have happened. But when you get to the other end of the persecution, unless you have some specific bishop that you can say, this bishop did this betrayal and they should be deposed, it doesn't make sense to demand people to get down on their knees. And who are we to demand they apologize to us when we were living in freedom in the United States and they were suffering under the Soviets? It doesn't make sense. It might make sense if we still had people in ROCOR who would actually live through the Soviet persecutions. They would certainly be in a better position to challenge people in Moscow Patriarchate. But by the time 2007 came along, we didn't have people who had experienced those things. We just had memories of people who had come before us that had experienced those things. And that's quite a different story. So I think approaching it in terms of recognition and mutually asking for forgiveness and giving each other forgiveness, and now trying to work together, was the way forward. And the thing is, I know of some people who were skeptical about reconciliation, but they didn't leave ROCOR. And as time has gone on, the ones that I know, they've come to see it as a positive thing. It's certainly.
Let me interject, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Why I feel pound of meat from the ROCOR perspective. Sergianism is not mentioned in the church and state document. We'll get into some detail about what it does cover when we're part of that presentation. But
it doesn't use the word Sergianism, but interesting, I didn't know this prior to having some back and forth and doing some research on this subject. But St. John of Shanghai never used the word Sergianism or Sergianist in any of his writings. And his history of ROCOR would have been a great opportunity for him to have used it if he was inclined to do so, and he never used it. I think that tells us something.
It's but I have to finish my point.
Okay.
what I believe the Jew Orthodox are correct about the pound of meat, for them to more just like how the Church of Serbia went back into union with the Church of Macedonia for one day before granting them autokephally the next day. For them to say, yes, Sergianism is wrong, right, would have, again, gone a long way to kind of deal with some issues which are still dealing with, like the reverberations of, we have one person mentioning, I don't know if it's accurate, but I'll just presume that it is, Patriarch Kirill calling Patriarch Sergius a confessor and stuff like that. Like, again, if we could all get behind, like, no, he was bad and he did the wrong thing, then this would have solved some of those issues. So I do feel the reunion could have got more of its pound of meat per se. And so that's what I mean by pound of meat.
But I just don't know that would have accomplished anything positive, and it probably would have made reconciliation, it probably would have meant that we wouldn't have had reconciliation when we did. One thing that I think is important is, there is such a thing as historical perspective. And we acknowledge, if you study history, we acknowledge that when you get further away from the emotions of a historical event, it's easier for people to talk about it in an honest way. And for a bishop who lived through the Soviet period, you could see why they might have felt like they needed to defend Metropolitan Sergius because, their church was being attacked by people all the time. And they didn't see Metropolitan Sergius as being this evil villain that they portrayed him to be. But the thing is, I don't think that you're going to see Metropolitan Sergius glorified as a saint.
Oh, no.
I think if someone was to try to push that through, it would not happen.
I know Father Ambrose is saying in his PhD's Moscow that Stalin personally edited letters on behalf of Metropolitan Sergius. So it's, it's probably not good if an atheist is writing your stuff.
Well, the thing is, though, what were the circumstances that he was living under? I mean, it's not like he was just freely saying, "Hey, Uncle Joe, why don't you edit my letters?" Stalin was a very scary figure, and that's why when they had the Communist Party congresses, when people started clapping in Stalin's speech, no one wanted to be the first person to stop clapping because they might wind up getting a visit about 3 o'clock in the morning and carting it off, and no one would ever see them. You don't want to be
the first person to start clapping either.
Well,
it's one of those.
So it's easy for us to say he should have done this, he should have done that. The thing is, if you're ever in that situation, I'll expect great things from you. But St. John of Shanghai, who's, I think, not just your average saint even, I think that he's an exceptional saint. His history of the Russian Church abroad gives a very charitable accounting of Metropolitan Sergius, and he's very sympathetic. He doesn't say that everything that he did was okay. He doesn't defend everything that he did, but he doesn't say this louse of a heretic, of a scum, because I think St. John had the humility to know, hey, if I was in that situation, I might have done the same thing. I mean, he probably wouldn't have, but I mean, he probably thought that to himself. I might. He had enough humility to tell himself that anyway.
We should always say apart from the grace of God, that could be any of us,
right.
Of course.
And back during some of the days when it seemed like the more extreme factions in ROCOR might actually be the ones that would wind up carrying the day in ROCOR. I remember being at a missions conference, and they had a guest speaker who was Father George Lauren, who is the father of recently reposed of Sister Vasa Lauren. But Father George Lauren was not a liberal. He actually knew St. John as a boy in Shanghai. He was a very pious priest, but at that time he expressed very negative views of the Moscow Patriarchate, and I was uncomfortable with it at the time listening to him talk. But one thing that struck me, though, about, he was talking about they did this, they betrayed the church, blah, 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 Sergianist that, Sergianist this. But they said, but you know what? If we were in their situation, we would have probably done the same thing or worse. And I thought, well, okay, I don't agree with what I'm hearing him say, but that's an Orthodox priest, an Orthodox Christian talking there, because he's saying, I can't really judge these people because if I was in their situation, I might have done worse than they did. That's a true Orthodox attitude to have about those things.
Now back to what the true Orthodox are correct about, at least in my opinion. Maybe not Father John's. We're giving Father John the opportunity to debate me, which is, Father John, you're kind of taking me in with your soft voice, your gray hair, and it's becoming very aggressive. That being said, there's the social issues, again, not in ROCOR, but generally speaking, that are taking foot in different corners of Orthodoxy, which is bad. These sort of things that are dissipating. And this is a big reason why I don't do clown mass apologetics against Roman Catholics, because anyone could judge you by your worst, and it's very easy to do. That being said, social issues, the female deacon in Egypt, in Africa, communing, again, that's something that will be pending a Pan-Orthodox Council. Just to make clear that one might really be happening if we could get peace in Ukraine, because both Bulgaria and Romania seem on board in recognizing only the UOC in Ukraine when the war is over. And so we're going to start having major jurisdictions meeting and solving some of these issues, hopefully these other social issues could come up, at least some of them. The communion of Roman Catholic spouses, like what the Greek Archdiocese does in the United States, totally unconscionable, based on non-canonical mixed marriages between Roman Catholics and Orthodox, saying that they're allegedly sacramental. They are not. They're not canonical. And but yet this occurs. This open intercommunion with Roman Catholic spouses, and it should not occur.
So are you saying that allowing an Orthodox person to marry a Roman Catholic is wrong in and of itself?
I'd say in the church, yes.
Because we've been doing that for a very long time. I mean, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, for example, was a Lutheran that married her Orthodox husband, and this happened in pre-revolutionary Russia. She wound up converting, but later. But that was allowed, and it was allowed because if you were an aristocrat in Russia, you were not allowed to marry below your class, which meant that your pool of potential spouses was limited, which is why they often wound up marrying people across religious lines. Was it ideal? I don't think so, but I mean, it was a dealing with a problem. Well, we have the same problem in the diaspora. You know, there are places where you can go where there's not lots of Orthodox people. And basically, if you said you can only marry Orthodox Christians, we're not going to allow any economia on this. What would actually wind up happening is people would just get married outside the church.
It wouldn't be canonical. Again, I'm not a bishop, so I have no power over this question. But for example, my wife and I were married not in the Orthodox Church because we converted into Orthodoxy, and then we were given crowns later in Jordanville, right?
Right.
And so nothing's precluding people from getting married, right? And then they're married, and then the other person converts, then they could do the sacrament of marriage.
Well, in the Orthodox Church, though, for an Orthodox Christian to get married outside of the church is considered to be a sin, and you can be excommunicated for that.
Well,
if you in your case, you were already married when you came in, but I'm talking about somebody who's already baptized.
With the Trulin canon.
So the bottom line of it is, it's a pastoral question, and here, if you took the hard line, the result would be that people would just end up getting married outside of the church, and in many cases, that would mean that they'd wind up raising their children outside of the church. Whereas with the pastoral economia that the Russian church has allowed for a very long time, we only will marry a couple in the church if the non-Orthodox spouse agrees to raise the children in the Orthodox church. And actually, that's something that is enforceable. So if that couple later got divorced and you have a written agreement to that effect, that's something that can be enforced by the court. You could present that to the court, and it would be a basis.
I do think it's telling to push back a little bit, that because it's not just the Russians, the Byzantines did this all the time. It was a large part of the diplomacy was marrying off daughters and whatnot. But we're talking about these political machinations, these Sergianisms before there was Sergianism per se. And like I said, it leads to these later problems, right? That's why I said these marriages aren't canonical, right. And it has led to this doctrinal development that the Greek Archdiocese has in communing Roman Catholic spouses. And so it's like, well, we already sacramentally recognize they're one flesh in the Orthodox Church, so why not commune them and stuff like that? And so my point,
they don't share the same faith. That would be why. If they want to become Orthodox, they're certainly welcome to do it. They can commune all they want once they become Orthodox.
So exactly. And anyway, and by doing this, we actually impede people from being Orthodox. So they said they're almost all the way there. Their husband or wife's communing, the kids are communing. Just submit to cremation, and then you can commune. It's not that complicated. And
right.
I don't open the can of worms otherwise in the Trulin canon. It's not a part of my bullet pointed list. Another one we'll disagree about, but we'll table the disagreement, is the issue of contraception. The issue of head covering. That's dissipating, but it's obviously the correct and historical and Orthodox practice. Here's one that you don't hear a lot because people probably don't even know it existed in recent memory, but maintaining gendered separated worship. This not just in monasteries. You could go to a local church in Syracuse, and the women's side has female saints on the walls, and the male side has male saints on the right side. And so you could walk in and not know too much about it, but oh yeah, women go to the left and men go to the right. But most Orthodox in America don't know that's traditional practice because that's almost disappeared entirely in the West. You won't even see this in a lot of pretty much anywhere, I would say. I don't see in the United States other than monasteries. But this was expected everywhere not that long ago. I don't even know if the true Orthodox do it, to be honest. So this might be thrown on more of a bone. Maybe they liberalized on this. They could leave comments if they want to get into that. They're not kneeling on Sundays, which people might not think is so much of an issue because in the United States, we tend to avoid that other than the Greeks. But in the old world, it's actually spreading like wildfire. Greek, Romania, even Russia, kneeling on Sundays, and it's an obvious aberration. In fact, Orthodox Ethos had a video against it today, but there's bishops that have commented on it, and it's historical development. It's not the original Orthodox practice, the kneel on Sunday for the Eucharist. Another thing that's dissipated in recent times has been requiring vigil and confession before communion the next day. Because I even know in OCA parishes, you'd speak to the old timers in OCA parish, like, yeah, into the 90s, we all had to go to Vespers and all had to confess in order if we're going to commune the next day. And so it's like even in very recent memory, in the more liberal jurisdictions, they were requiring that. And I've been to Moscow Patriarchate liturgies, and generally speaking, no one goes to vigil. You confess during the liturgy. And at least then they're requiring confession. I do know that exceptions are made, obviously, for the very elderly, where it's difficult enough for them to get to liturgy, let alone to go both at night when they can't drive and all this stuff. And so, again, these are general things I'm talking about. I'm not trying to get to every little detail and every little situation, and I'm not a bishop. CYOSF, consult your own spiritual father. So anyway, I purposely went through that list of stuff, and we saw some pushback between Father John and I. What I said, so people know I'm trying to be a good faith actor here of what the true Orthodox are correct about. Now, that being said, I am not true Orthodox, and I want to give the reasons why I'm not true Orthodox, and in good sort of like historian sort of way, right? Rise, fall, the papacy, and all that stuff. I got historical reasons, but let me get to the more shallow, simple reasons first, because I think for the average person, they're going to have to make a decision on this without having published books on the ecclesiology of the church. And here are some of my shallow reasons. Small, tiny splinter groups tend to be wrong. I mean, right? Like if you're the true, genuine Orthodox Christians of, Southern Colorado, something already sounds wrong there. And we can see in this picture of the Greek Orthodox Old Calendar schisms, and thankfully we see sometimes they go back into communion and sometimes they split again. Generally speaking, that's a sign of a sickness. So that's, again, not thinking much harder about it. This just looks wrong. Another thing is conspiratorial people tend to be wrong. When everything's a conspiracy, right? There's no bottom to the rabbit hole. You just keep on digging. And, oh, you're a normie. How dare you think, something normal occurred? There's something wrong with you. The world's round. That's crazy. Haven't you saw the Twitter thread that proves that it's flat? That sort of stuff. Those people tend to be wrong. Now, I've never been to outer space. I've not, put under examination everything about the moon landing and everything. So I'm not going to say I know 100% all this normie stuff's right. I guess that's not the point. The point is just usually not everything is a conspiracy. So if you have a group where it's based upon all these conspiracies and, and the truth is not in these documents or those documents are altered and blah, 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 generally speaking, they're wrong. Not always wrong. Again, shallow reason. I'm not saying these are smoking gun silver bullets here. Again, people say conspiracies about myself, which, because I know it's in my own mind, I know are wrong. So I take that to heart. That being said, divisive people tend to be wrong as well. The people that fight over everything and there's just no love, it's just all about what's right and just causing arguments for no reason, they tend to be wrong. Again, they're not wrong about everything. Even a broken clock's right twice a day. But again, they tend to be wrong. Now, here's one that people should think a little more about, which is the appeals to Catholicity in the ROCOR and the true Orthodox polemic. So when I say ROCOR, this would be before the Union. It would come up quite a bit that Catholicity is the orthodoxy of the faith, and that comes up by St. Vincent de Lorenz. But Catholicity sometimes does regard geographic spread. So, for example, writing against the Donatists, St. Augustine says, well, you're not communing with the rest of the Eastern churches, so how could he be the true church? Right? So he's appealing to a geographic Catholicity. And so someone could just look at the Orthodox Church and go, all right, there's this world canonical body of churches, and there's this divisive, very split bodies of true Orthodox churches. The one big, more cogent body looks more correct. Again, it's a little shallow, but it's not a precedent that is lacking in the patristics. So it's worth bringing up. Another thing that comes up, which again, for someone more critically minded like myself, is they seem to be very fast and loose with facts. Like they'll say things like there's 20 million true Orthodox on Earth, and that's at least 10 times more than what's in the census data. And even that's probably, census data overshoots it a little bit. Because in general, even census data overshoots how many real Eastern Orthodox believers there are. The canonical, the world Orthodox. Because in general, people will just identify because they're baptized in the church. I'm Orthodox, but they never attend church. And they're part of the number. And lastly, I already kind of touched on it, amongst the shallow reasons, the million acronyms, right? Anyone that, can't just say, I'm Orthodox Catholic, I'm Eastern Orthodox, a historical name that existed in the first millennium, but it has to add a bunch of things to it. And so you got a very long alphabet soup sort of name, tends to be wrong. Again, not always, but tends to be wrong amongst my shallow reasons.
That reminds me of, Frankie Schaeffer, of course, went insane, but back when he was still sane and Orthodox, he came out with a novel entitled Portofino, and it was really sort of a thinly veiled novel based on his own life growing up in Switzerland with his father, who was Francis Schaeffer, who was a Presbyterian missionary. And one of the funny things in the book is that as the novel progresses, the father of the family winds up switching into another Presbyterian church, but every time there's a new C that's added to the acronyms, they start off as like the PCA, and then it's the PCCA, and then it's the PCCCA. So it just gets more ridiculous as it goes on. Well, that's kind of, the old calendar groups are kind of that way. When you start having to get into, we're in, ROCOR A .2 or something like that, or, ROSI .510 or something, it starts getting into an area of ridiculous division. And I think it's reasonable to ask, why, if you people are all on the same page, like Father Joseph tries to portray when he's doing his shows, and he's got a Matthewite on there, and he's on there being from the Milan Synod or connected to the Milan Synod, and then he's got somebody from the more mainstream Greeks on there, and they all agree to attack us and then to attack the other mainstream Orthodox, but the Matthewites don't think those other people have grace. I mean, that's just the fact. Father Joseph would not be communed at a Matthewite parish unless something dramatically has changed since the last time I checked. He certainly wouldn't be allowed to serve. His jurisdiction is seen as being uncanonical by most of the Greek Old Calendarists. And, when I was a layman in Houston at the St. Vladimir parish, and then later on a deacon, the priest who was over that parish most of that time was Father George Lardus, who was a Greek-American, a liturgical and linguistic genius, and a rocket scientist on top of that. I mean, this guy really, he's still living, and he's an incredibly intelligent man. Well, he's a graduate from Jordanville, and he wrote his thesis in longhand, but he wrote it on the history of the Greek Old Calendarist, and it was the first history that had been written in English, and he had access to the Synod files. And unfortunately, because it was handwritten and it was never published, I've not been able to read it. I've only been able to hear him talk about it. But I remember him saying years ago when he was talking about their history is what you find is that none of these old calendars are telling the truth. They all have aspects of their story that don't add up, and they basically just lie about it. And I've read several Greek Old Calendar histories from the perspective of one faction or the other, and that's exactly what you find is that there's always something there that doesn't really make sense. For example, the Kyanos Synod, they were all, their bishops were consecrated at a certain point, and their history says with the tacit approval of Archbishop Maxentius. Well, on what planet does the Orthodox Church give tacit approval for the consecration of bishops? Like, that's not a thing. So that's something that doesn't make sense. But then, the other histories also have things that don't make sense too. And that's the reason why, like I said, ROCOR entered into communion twice with different old calendar groups, and it didn't last because this kind of stuff. And as a matter of fact, when we went into communion with the Kyanos Synod, I remember a woman by the name of Nina Secco, who was originally in ROCOR. She was connected with the Panlamanites. She went into schism with them. I think she later became a nun, and she's now reposed, if I'm not mistaken. But I remember her emailing me privately about this, and she said, you're going to find getting involved with the Greeks is bad news. And she was saying that as someone who was in a Greek Old Calendar group, and she was basically saying, you're going to regret this. And I wouldn't have thought at the time that I would later say, you know what, Nina, you were right. But it didn't pan out the way we thought it was going to pan out at the time. And so my experience with this whole thing has been that I think ROCOR made a lot of mistakes in its dealings with the Greek Old Calendar.
And we'll unpack that history real soon, but because I got to interrupt with this. Craig, your eyes are beautiful. I keep telling my wife that.
That's how you deceptively suck people into your evil machinations.
I get lost in the ocean of my blue eyes.
That's right.
So, amongst the reasons why I'm not true Orthodox, is that they started it, right? Who started the schism? They started it. And it's just a shallow criteria. And it's a criterion from St. Cyprian, and I find historically it's the most repeatable and easy to identify criteria for a side that's wrong. The Novatians started it. The Donatists started it. The Roman Catholics started it. It's, the Miaphysites, they started it. It's very easy to point, all these people that started it and went against the consensus of the church. So I don't find it to be a shallow criteria, though it's a very simple criteria. And so when we unpack the history, you'll realize even with a very charitable view of, let's say, a GOCK and the more legitimate groups, it's going to be they still part of something they started per se, and that is something where they started, but because the other side was wrong and they're mean. The other side was wrong. We covered that, and they were mean. We didn't get to cover a lot of the persecutions, but yes, that existed. But actually breaking communion is something you identify repeatedly in history the wrong side. And so it's a simple criteria, but not a shallow one, I think. But anyway, just as a matter of reflection, shallow reasons are enough initially, I think, for the average person. I don't expect people to go watch 3-hour streams like this one, because this one's not at 3 hours, but Father, I think we're getting there. We'll be there in an hour and a half. But all these things are decent reasons where a normal human being, again, not a historian, is going to come to the conclusion that, true Orthodoxy is not for me. Now, let me give you the meat of my personal reasons. We already covered they started it, right? And these are my more profound reasons. And the others I find are ecclesiastical issues, that the true Orthodox is canonically irregular in its largest group, which is the Greek group. And I don't mean canonically irregular in a negative way. I'm going to unpack that. All right. I'm going to give a short history from true Orthodox sources. I'll only once, I think before the end of this, I'll let you know when I cite something that came from another source. But these came from true Orthodox sources. One includes Subdeacon Nectario, something he wrote. The other being a video about his name's escaping, but we'll cover him in a second. But again, I'm not saying I'm a scholar in true Orthodoxy. Not my point. My point is, I, as a normal human being, not totally invested in this, looked into true Orthodox sources and came up with this history, and I'm going to tell you what I found. All right, so persecutions devastated the Greek old calendars. All right, and the remaining bishops they had didn't replace themselves. All right, so like they didn't ordain new bishops to replace themselves. And so Metropolitan and perhaps Saint, we'll see, over decades or maybe a century from now, Christomos of Florina works on trying to convince the patriarchs in the calendar. Now, this is already interesting because we're told that the World Orthodox graceless are not the real church, but the origin of their church is with a bishop they consider a saint that dealt with the World Orthodox as legitimate churches. And so this gets ignored a lot, but it's a pretty obvious detail, I find. And, and I'll have an apology. There might be nuances I'm missing here, but it just seems to me this pretty obvious detail. Now, Chrysostomos, he died in 1955, and now the true Orthodox Greeks are bishopless. And according to a World Orthodox source, the idea was supposedly that the Greek true Orthodox synod was like a synod in resistance. They weren't looking to self-replace. They were looking to influence the main Greek synod and hopefully bring them back ultimately onto the old calendar. I personally think, from my own reading of history, that a lot of this is regional. When you follow some of these figures, whether it's Chrysostomos and others, there'd be in parts of Greece which were known that those villages are true Orthodox or old calendar, and there'd be other villages that are new calendar. And so a lot of these clergy were just representing where they came from or their flock in a certain given locality. And so they weren't seeing this as this larger, grander thing that they were going to change the whole Orthodox world. They were more concerned about serving their people where they were. Okay. And again, especially amongst the people converting to Orthodoxy, it's hard for us to understand that because Orthodoxy isn't in our actual like familial roots, while this wouldn't be true in Orthodox countries. So anyway, whatever the truth of that may be, the true Orthodox don't have a bishop. And so what do? The Metropolitan, which is now the OCA, and ROCOR petitions to ordain a true Orthodox Greek bishop for the USA. Well, what are the ramifications of this? Well, obviously, they're not considered graceless if the Metropolitan was approached first. Right? The OCA essentially was approached to make a bishop for the Greek old calendars. Well, again, if the World Orthodox are graceless, they don't have true holy orders, all these, then how can you come to them for an episcopacy? Maybe there's some subtle detail here I'm missing, but it just, to me, looking at the history, again, from true Orthodox sources, doesn't make sense to me. I'm just being honest. All right? Now, they were, of course, particularly the Metropolitan were in communion with what are called became the canonical churches of North America. They were in communion with the World Orthodox churches. So what happened next? Two ROCOR bishops secretly consecrate a bishop in 1960. The ROCOR Synod officially rejects this, right? They don't approve of it. They feel they're concerned about trying to get international recognition from countries like synods like Serbia and whatnot. What they don't want to do is stir the pot and get involved in this, get involved in some Greek matter. They were more concerned about Russia and Russians. But that being said, ostensibly, this rejection was sort of, I don't know, disingenuous might be an uncharitable way to put it, but I'll just use the word. Think of me in the most positive way possible using that word. Right? Because ostensibly they did this not to offend the World Orthodox Greek Church, which they considered valid.
Well,
right?
I think that,
but secretly, they approved of it. And
looking at Subdeacon Nectarius's book on the connection of the Russian Church abroad and the old calendar, is what he says is that they were trying to accommodate the opinions of Metropolitan Anastasi, who was always opposed to this. And he does say that St. John approved of it. I've not seen quotes that would say that he actually said, hey, yeah, this was great. And I think that...
here's what I saw. The year that they ordained the bishop that was in Queens, what was his name? His name will come up in the
Petros.
presentation. Yes, Petros.
Yeah.
That St. John did write him a letter, and him and several other ROCOR clergy took a picture right next to the church there. And so the idea is they concelebrated. Whether that really occurred, I don't know. But the letter...
Yeah, I don't know whether they can celebrate it or not, but the letter, I think, is a letter thanking him for his hospitality. I think that Father Seraphim's letters indicate that St. John had, favorable opinion of Metropolitan Petros. But when the Synod said
you can't
that those...
working against him, though, if he's showing up to his church and accepting hospitality and
well, I mean,
whatnot. But
the thing is, but St. John, when he was in Shanghai, he was invited to attend the consecration of an Anglican bishop. And there's newspaper accounts that says that he was there and he was wearing a mantilla, which is another, when people say ROCOR is liberal now, that's something that would never happen today. And, but I think St. John was being polite. He probably had good relations with the Anglicans in Shanghai, and he was invited to come. And so he did.
He allegedly also attended all the Orthodox churches in San Francisco on, I forget, during, I think,
On Holy Saturday, he would go from parish to parish and he would venerate the Holy Table. Archbishop Peter told, and he wouldn't tell me that personally, he told a whole group of people that several times. And he didn't make a distinction between Greeks or even OCA. At that time, it would have been Metropolia. And there might even have been a Moscow Patriarchate parish in San Francisco at that time. I know there is now, but I don't know about back then.
Well, be that as it may, just like I'd have all the documents for, I'll just accept that he's one of the people that accepted it, but did not. Again, none of this was official. I think until 1969.
Well, let me just differ with you slightly on this. St. John was trained as a lawyer, and he was an expert in canon law. And I think when the Synod said these consecrations are invalid, I can't imagine St. John saying, well, we're just saying that, but we don't mean it. Whether he thought that they should have been invalid or not, the Synod said that they were invalid. And I think that if you asked him, are these consecrations valid or invalid? I think he would have said they're invalid, because that's what the Synod decided.
All right, point taken. So to continue, these secret consecrations continued without synodical approval and continued in Greece. So they started in America, interestingly, in Detroit, and then it was in New York City, and then they started happening in Greece. And so calling this canonically irregular is actually quite charitable, because it did not have synodical approval. And then make clear, just like it's the tacit approval of a patriarch or an archbishop or whoever, that's not how it works. When it comes to these consecrations, they need the approval of the whole synod. It's a matter of consensus. Again, painstakingly proved out in Rise and Fall of the Papacy. This is a very important ecclesiological understanding. So these are canonically irregular, no doubt about it. Their episcopal origins canonically irregular. But there are historical precedents for people on the right side of something to have canonical irregularities. For example, the Diophysite Syrians during the Henoticon. They walled themselves up from communion to everyone other than the Pope of Rome. And that's despite them not being anywhere remotely close to his jurisdiction. But that's an example, for the sake of orthodoxy, of people doing something canonically irregular. Another example are the Diophilites during the 7th century. St. Martin tried having a program with John of Philadelphia and Stephen of Dora to ordain new bishops in Antioch's and Jerusalem's jurisdictions. It didn't pan out. We might unpack that a little more a little later, but the point is canonically irregular. There already were churches there. They just had monothelites. So it's not that these canonically irregular ecclesiastical activities have never occurred before and haven't occurred with groups on the right side of a given question, but are they canonically irregular? The answer is yes. And that's just the point I want to make. So that being said, with the Diophilite controversy, what doesn't get spoken about a lot is that the 6th Synod fixes the Diophilite, the monothelite controversy, and with the Diophilites winning the day. And the 6th Synod reconciles Constantinople Synod, which was monothelite, Antioch Synod, and deposes a patriarch, which was monothelite. All right. Rome is part of the Synod through their legates. Rome was in communion under Pope Vitalian with the Monothelites. All right. And so if this graceless world Orthodox theology is correct, then because people in communion with heretics existed in the 7th century, even amongst those with Orthodox opinions, this would undo the whole church. It's game over now, right?
This is the Cootie theory of the canons, and it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. That being said, I want to be honest with the sources, and there's somewhat of a lack of sources on this error. I want to be honest with sources where Antioch didn't get to elect a patriarch regularly for decades. So you could argue, well, their synod really never consented to this state of being because they didn't really have patriarchal elections, and their synods didn't get to have meetings. And I'll concede all those points. But did synods like Constantinople's reconcile, and they were monothelite? The answer is yes. Did synods like Rome enter communion with monothelites? The answer is yes, even though they maintained dithelite doctrine. And so, be that as it may, I just don't think you could draw the extreme conclusion of the Cootie's version of ecclesiology. And so, we'll keep it going. So, amongst the Greek Old Calendarists were the Matthewite True Orthodox. Their synod already had bishops, I think since 1938, but they originated by non-canonical ordinations with one bishop doing the ordaining. So you need, if I remember the apostolic canon right, you need 3 bishops to do ordination. The point is you need more than one.
It says 2 or 3. I think that might be canon 1 of the apostles.
So you need a few, right? You need a few, not just one. So they submitted to ROCOR and allowing them reconsecrate their entire episcopacy so that way at least could be canonical. So again, the origin of the Matthewites was not canonical. The fact that they submit to their body being corrected by ROCOR. At that point, though, at least the ROCOR Synod was consenting to it. Now, ROCOR attempts to unite the feuding True Orthodox Greeks factions that formed, and they were divided on the question of whether the World Orthodox Greek Church had grace or not. And again, this gets to this sort of feuding. We already went into the past how Chrysostomos of Florina, right, he was working with the patriarchs of his time. He understood that they were part of the church. We understand that when the True Orthodox in America were having their episcopacy reestablished by ROCOR, that before they went to ROCOR, they went to the OCA. It was the Metropolitan. So we already know that there were people within the Greek Orthodox orbit that were old calendarists that recognized the World Orthodox were canonical churches. That being said, both factions reconcile. So, right, but they take the Matthewite opinion, the Cootie's view of ecclesiology, which is interesting. So there's this development within Greek True Orthodoxy away from the original Greek True Orthodox view, which is worth bringing up. Now, this led people like Metropolitan and perhaps Saint, we'll have to see. Again, we'll see decades or a century or so from now. Petros of Astoria, I believe he was the lone opposition to this in Greek True Orthodoxy. All right.
And for a period of time, he was isolated, and he actually petitioned ROCOR to be accepted into our synod. And before he died, he actually was accepted into ROCOR.
So that is, and this is important because it shows where ROCOR stood during all this. So ROCOR advised Metropolitan Petros not to submit to the graceless confession that the Greek True Orthodox were reconciling over. And so they said that there must be a conciliar solution, ecumenical council that will solve the calendar issue and determine this question. And so that was the actual official synodical stance of ROCOR. And so oddly, this resulted in Metropolitan Petros being excommunicated by ROCOR, which really isn't fair, but this is what actually occurred. So he was excommunicated by ROCOR and also the Greek True Orthodox. And he was the one who didn't change. He was keeping the same view that everyone always had. But again, ROCOR was concerned about the Russian church. They weren't trying to get involved in this local Greek issue. They were extricating themselves from it, and they didn't recognize the gracelessness of the world churches. Again, doesn't mean they endorsed the grace in the world churches synodically. That's not the point I'm making. My point is they didn't recognize the gracelessness, and that's why they said there has to be an ecumenical council to determine this question.
And this is actually an important point because if you go back to 1995 and you ask the question, why did ROCOR go into communion with the Kyanos Synod and not with the Chrysostomus Kyusa Synod at the time, which was the bigger Greek Old Calendar Synod? Well, the reason is the Kyanos Synod did not condemn the other churches. They assumed that the other churches had grace. They would commune people who visited their monasteries that were parts of these other churches, but they felt like they could not concelebrate with the clergy of those churches because of the problems that were going on. So clearly that was ROCOR's position consistently throughout this entire period, that ROCOR as a synod, not that there weren't bishops that maybe had different opinions. I don't even think Metropolitan Philaret thought that all the other local churches were without grace. He did think the Moscow Patriarchate was, and he also thought the same thing of the Evlogian group, which was the Paris Exarchate that had been part of ROCOR and then went under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. He considered them to be schismatics. Interestingly, St. John, when he was the bishop of in Western Europe, was communing these people, and so Metropolitan Philaret later complains about this. I don't understand the position of Laodica John, although he was a holy man, but I don't know why he didn't dot the I's and cross the T's and explain to these people, the perilousness of their situation. So when they try to paint St. John as being some sort of an old calendarist that agrees with their position, there's just too much evidence that that's not the case. Was he sympathetic with at least some of the old calendars? I think he was. But he was not of their mindset. As a matter of fact, I came across an old calendarist that wrote an article about St. John, and they obviously didn't think St. John was a saint because they were attacking him on a number of issues, including communing the Evlogians.
Laodica John Shaw write that article?
No, this is an old calendarist.
Oh, and, no, but I thought it was Laodica John Shaw that was quoting that article from like Vladimir Moss or something.
This is not Vladimir Moss either. I can't remember the name of the guy, although I could pull it up if you really want to know.
It's okay. Keep it going.
But basically, the other thing that he pointed out in this article was that when St. John was the bishop of Western Europe, when he brought in that French Orthodox church, and they had for a period of time, they actually consecrated a bishop for those people. He allowed them to be on the new calendar. So St. John oversaw basically a vicar bishop in basically a diocese of Western Rite new calendars, and he was okay with that. And I think this article claims they were even on the Gregorian Pascalian, which I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that he wouldn't have said that if he didn't believe it.
Though he wouldn't want that to be a permanent solution, though.
Well, when did he say, okay, you're going to be transitioning to the old calendar? I think that he basically...
I'll leave that to Sneck because he's translating a lot of this stuff in French into English.
Yeah. But
I don't know.
but like the other two new calendar synods that were in ROCOR at the time were Romanian and Bulgarian, and there was never any understanding that, hey, we're going to let you be on the new calendar, but when this date happens, that's when you're going to switch, because it was when ROCOR tried to force them on the old calendar, and I think it was either maybe during Metropolitan Philaret's time, but it might have been under Metropolitan Vitali. But at some point, the Synod basically gave them an ultimatum: either you switch or else, and they chose or else, and they wound up in the OCA.
I guess there's worse things. So that being said, there's I think anyone watching, and again, this history is from true Orthodox sources. Again, consider the person reading it. I'm not true Orthodox. I could be reading things wrong. But here's what I think it looks like. It's a mess, right? Like, ROCOR telling Metropolitan Petros, don't do this. You're excommunicated anyway. It's a mess. But it's a mess of good intentions, right? They're trying to do the right thing and work through these political squabbles. And again, the Russian church is worried about the Russian people. The Greek true old calendars are worried about the Greek people. And Americans tend to think of, well, why aren't they thinking of these international, interjurisdictional solutions? And that's not how they were thinking. That would be imposing a way of thinking very alien to what the true Orthodox movement was operating like during those early days. So anyway, ROCOR eventually re-enters into communion with Cyprianites because this view on grace, which gives a good idea that ROCOR kind of consistently always saw that the world Orthodox had grace. Metropolitan Petros maintains good relations with everyone. Again, that's why I say he'll maybe be a saint someday. And by the 90s, he's reconciled with all sides. I just want to point out that the political and bureaucratic nature of true Orthodoxy during this era is very messy. So what I even say here is a very simplistic distillation of a lot more moving parts. All right. So that being said, I want to make another apology now, because that was the history. Now I'm going to start getting into more specific critiques. And we know this is a day and age where everyone wants to pretend they're chest banging men, but then they cry when people have an opinion other than theirs, and they can't be adults and listen to it and disagree in a honorable sort of way. So I'm going to get critical here. All right, I'm going to get critical of true Orthodoxy, but in defense of ROCOR. All right, that's all I'm doing. I'm not interested in evangelizing true Orthodox. I don't think I have the blessing for this. I don't have the inclination for it. I'm not interested in divisions between Orthodox. So I'm just giving the following critiques because I feel that they are ecclesiastically instructive. They're useful for what I do with apologetics when it comes to Roman Catholics and other things like that. And again, all these accusations against me demanded, where does Craig really stand on this stuff? Well, now you get to see. It's not because I'm trying to evangelize and poach your members, okay? Now, I want to say out of all fairness, the true Orthodox usually dedicate most of their time to evangelizing the world Orthodox. So if you can't calmly accept the fact that someone from the side you're evangelizing will defend themselves from it, I feel shows that you have very thin skin and it's very effeminate. So just be a man and take the critique and disagree with facts and don't get all personal. All right. There needs to be a reclaiming of what it means to be masculine, because a lot of the stuff in apologetics and the macho debates, it's not. It's cat fights. It's ridiculous. So anyway, we're going to be going over the 2014 Joint True Orthodox Statement, otherwise known as the True Orthodox Church and the Heresy of Ecumenism, Dogmatic and Canonical Issues. This is the most official statement of modern-day True Orthodox belief. It's signed on by the largest groups of Greek, Romanian, and Russian True Orthodoxy. The Bulgarian True Orthodox Church is tiny. It's only about 20 parishes. But Bishop Foti's 2013 official statement, right around this statement, is very similar. And I know there was a period of time they were in communion. They might be in communion today. So I do think by critiquing this statement, it kind of critiques the whole world version of the True Orthodox movement. Now, again, because True Orthodoxy has lots of other splinter groups, this won't have 100%, but this is probably a solid 90 or at least 80% of True Orthodoxy is covered by this. And so by me critiquing this, it's the most legitimate thing I could critique of their doctrinal views. This document's still on the GOCK website, which is where I got it. And so this is not some sort of like random thing that is, from a website that's from someone else. Like they were criticizing some non-official Moscow website that had articles that say who put them there from a heretic, from that Barker lady. And they're like, oh, this shows the Moscow Patriarchate doesn't believe the Theotokos and all these things. And it's like, that'd be drawing too much of a conclusion because we don't even know who uploaded this thing. It's not even an official website. This document is an official document on the official website, synodically accepted by these synods. So I can't be accused of that by critiquing this document. Now, my humble opinion, and I want to say this actually very humbly, is that the document contains transparent ecclesiastical errors. All right? And I could be reading this document wrong when I admit this, because I'm not in the True Orthodox wavelength. I'm not really emotionally and personally invested in their issues. I'm reading this as an outsider, as someone who studies ecclesiology for the sake of apologetics, particularly against Roman Catholics. I'm really not very concerned about these intra-Orthodox issues. It's really not the majority of my channel. But So that being said, I could be wrong. I'm not part of the wavelength that made this thing. And we sometimes have to say this. We think we understand something because we read words. But if you're not part of the group that wrote it or not from the era it was written, you can misunderstand its actual point. So I just want to be humble and admit that. Now, that being said, 110, you'll see the citations of parts of this document. I'm going to read in italics what the document says, then I'm going to give a critique. Father John, feel free to jump in. So the statement states, every bishop who proclaims heresy publicly and barefacedly in church or is in syncretistic communion with those of other beliefs or religions becomes a false bishop and a false teacher, while those bishops who commune with him are destroyed together with him. And they quote St. Theodore of Studite on that point. So my response. St. Theodore the Studite implicitly recognized the validity of the Constantinopolitan holy orders in seeking to restore Constantinople to Pentarchic communion. All right, I have a citation on screen, but we know that he was part of a program that was trying to get the Constantinopolitan Synod to repent. So he obviously didn't think because there's heresy in that synod, that whole synod became void of grace. Otherwise, this whole way of trying to reconcile synod would not work. Now, we also have this, I think, very point-blank quote from St. Theodore where he says, we are certain that God has not abandoned the church of our country. Right? So it seems to be a pretty plain statement that he doesn't ascribe to the Cooties' view of ecclesiology, which he's being quoted as supporting.
Well, and another thing that needs to be understood is the first and second synod, which is where we have that 15th canon that the old counterists like to quote, was held in the wake of the synod, the schism that happened under St. Theodore, where he went into schism with a patriarch who's also a saint, whose name escapes me at the moment, but it was over the Moekian schism is what it was called, because that means adultery in Greek, and the patriarch had allowed an emperor to get married for the fourth time, and St. Theodore thought that that was wrong, and he broke communion. Well, that is the reason why I think it's Canon 13 or 14 says that you can't break communion with a bishop who's merely in violation of the canons. And so clearly that synod was saying, this was not the way to go. Now, St. Theodore is still a saint, and, he's a great theologian, defender of icons and all that. But the fact that he said something doesn't mean that that's canon law, because there are actual canons that were written in response to what he did that really didn't quite go along with what he had actually done.
I think one thing people miss, whether it's St. Theodore and other people, is the polemical. Sometimes a saint will take a polemical extreme take on something, right? He's going a little beyond his actual position, or at least his practical position, right? Because we see St. Theodore trying to reconcile entire synod of Constantinople. And so to take certain statements of that saint against their actual actions, I think is, again, believe facts rather than words, like the back of my book says, right? The St. Gregory the Great. We have to be aware of the certain polemical overstatements that do exist and not take them literally and then ignore the actual practical applications of those words that those same saints did. Now, that being said, remember, 110 was talking about bishops like in communion with not only just heretics, but people of other religions, which is clearly abominable, and some of the weird stuff happening in the World Council of Churches back in the 70s and stuff. So yes, that stuff's wrong and condemnable. Now, anyhow, the church historically used conciliar solutions to restore entire synods. So this is something we don't see in true Orthodoxy. True Orthodoxy tends to create splinter synods on the alleged correctitude of a doctrine. And there's no precedent for that in the early church. It looks more like 20th and 21st century Anglicanism. Every time one group of some Anglican body gets way too crazy, they split off and create some other new Anglican group. But generally speaking, Orthodoxy, we find synods, if we read church history, synods go to heresy, and then entire synods get reconciled. Yes, there's individual bishops in those synods that don't, and that's a good thing. But that's what we see. And so what St. Theodore the Studite was actually following was this synodical reconciliation model, because that's the only model that really we find in early church history. Now, being that that's the case, something like a synod in resistance makes sense. Syrian Diophysites were such, right? And in the 6th century, perhaps Metropolitan Christomos of Florina, if my interpretation of events between the 30s and 50s are correct, that, right, they weren't looking to replace the Greek World Orthodox Church. They were looking to influence the Greek World Orthodox Church. And so by being in resistance, they're hoping to change things for the better and to preserve the correct doctrine for those they were shepherds over. Hence why they didn't replace themselves.
One point about the early history of the Greek Old Calendarist that I think is important to understand is that actually before Bishop Matthew broke off from the rest of the Old Calendarist and then went his own way, the Church of Greece was actually preparing to switch back to the old calendar, because basically what these bishops did affect enough pressure on the synod to where they were in the process of giving in.
So it was working.
But then when Bishop Matthew went his own way and declared everybody else to be without grace, that basically gave them the cover to say, oh, these people are a bunch of kooks, and they wound up staying on the new calendar. So if the old calendar is actually stated,
I don't know any details about that, but I'll say this ignorant opinion, being that I just heard it from you, which is, if true, and I have no reason to doubt you, Father, how could that not be the work of the devil? Because that would nip this whole
work
thing
of the
in the
devil.
bud.
I mean, schism is the work of the devil. You know, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, a disciple of the Apostle John, he says, no one who follows another into a schism will inherit the kingdom of God. So I think we should be concerned about heresies, modernism, people who violate the canons, but we should be concerned about schisms too, because not inheriting the kingdom of God is a pretty bad thing. So going into schism when you don't have a valid justification for doing it is also not a good thing.
Absolutely. So back to the true Orthodox statement. It continues at the core of ecumenism. So it's giving its definition of ecumenism, why it condemns it. Our so-called baptismal theology, dogmatic syncretism, the abolition of the boundaries of the church, the recognition of ecumenical brotherhood, the theory of sister churches, a denial of the ecclesiological and soteriological exclusivity of the Orthodox Church, even to the synodal recognition of heterodox communities. All right. Now, that's the definition of ecumenism. I agree that definition is bad. I don't endorse that ecumenism. But you're in ROCOR, Father. Does ROCOR endorse any of that?
No.
No.
And I don't think the Russian church does either.
Bulgaria does enjoy it. I don't think anyone does. Nobody endorses that form of ecumenism. I mean,
the ecumenical patriarchate comes as close as anybody does to endorsing it. And, you know, if I was in the Greek...
Yeah, I think the EP, definitely the patriarch does say things. But that's why my point, has any World Orthodox Synod other than the EP officially or explicitly endorsed any of that ecumenical theology?
Not that I'm aware.
I think the answer is no.
No.
You know, and there's joint statements, but what are the authority of these joint statements? They're not synodically approved. So yeah, you could find some people saying heretical things, but that'd be like us finding, you know, some heretical things from one or two true Orthodox people and say that represents everyone that's part of this true Orthodox statement. That would not be fair. If you notice, I'm not critiquing every random thing that I could find from random people. I'm critiquing a specific authoritative statement. All right. And so this kind of disputation with ecumenism is, yeah, we agree with you, but it's not the basis for being separated from World Orthodox, because the World Orthodox don't ascribe to that ecumenism. All right, and that's my point here. Now, I do agree, and I concur, that tolerance for the ecumenical patriarch on this statement, on this basis, is too much. I don't know why. I know everyone doesn't want to stir the pot. Maybe that's why God's allowed the schism in Ukraine, and all this stuff's going to come to a head. But this sort of allowance for ridiculousness is no different than the 50s and 60s, right? When was it Patriarch Athenagoras? So who's the one that got rid of the anathemas against Roman Catholics and stuff like that?
It was Athenagoras.
Yeah. So right,
of course, Meletios Metaxakis. And his successor in Constantinople both went into communion with the living church, and they remained in communion with them until after World War II. And that was a schismatic and heretical group.
And so, like, that's my point. So, like, we do have a basis, even amongst the true Orthodox history, that there's been tolerance for stuff like this.
Yeah.
I'm not endorsing that tolerance. I'm against it. Again, I'm just a layperson with no skin in the
Right.
game. So why wouldn't I want perfection? I want perfection, right?
I would like perfection too, but we just have to acknowledge that when we look at church history, we see messy situations like this.
Now, to continue my response, the true Orthodox excommunicated ROCOR, right? Despite them not being ecumenists. And the rationale is, right, ROCOR invalidated itself because they entered communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. And the Moscow Patriarchate at that time was communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which is, again, flagrantly ecumenical. But ecumenist. But the Moscow Patriarchate, as of today, right, is no longer in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So this is no longer the issue of why ROCOR is got the cooties. But I don't see anyone knocking ROCOR's door there. All right, now we can fix this whole situation. Because it's not about that.
And to give an example of a similar situation, after 1054, Constantinople was not in communion with Rome, but other parts of the Orthodox Church remained in communion with Rome for a couple centuries after that.
Exactly. It's if we apply what's in the statement, and we'll continue, it just invalidates. It's you're cutting the branch off at which you're sitting, and that's what we're seeing here. This idea for someone else being communion with someone else is not reason to excommunicate. Generally, in church history, you could directly excommunicate the person that's wrong on something, but as long as the other group is, let's say, I'll take a third jurisdiction, like in the Malaysian Schism, they're not part of the issue, but they're more tolerant than you are of this offending party. You don't excommunicate the person for being tolerant. You don't see that in church history. So I don't see that as a basis for excommunication. Now, they continue the joint statement, again, italics. Sergius headed an outwardly proper church organization so that in the hands of the revolutionaries, it could become an unwitting tool in their unrelenting warfare against the very church herself. Sergianism gives a definition, the adoption of the delusion that deception could be used as a means to preserve the truth and that collaboration ensures the church, survival. All right, so it condemns Sergianism. That's the definition of Sergianism. It condemns. But here's my response to this. We saw Father Ambrose he's saying there's just one canonized saint within the World Orthodox body that actually condemns Sergianism by name. I think there'll be more. Ultimately, it's St. Philaret of New York will ultimately be canonized by ROCOR. And stuff like that. So we'll have more that say bad things about Sergius and Sergianism. But we have, at least traditionally, because I'm going to presume the authenticity of this synod of Uskut 1937. It was in the catacombs and in secret. So and the first thing written about it was 10 years later. So some historians wouldn't be solely convinced that it's real, but I'm just going to presume that it's real because it's been historically part of the ROCOR polemic for decades. And here's the heresy of Sergianism as defined by the synodical statement before the true Orthodox left ROCOR.
Well, let me push back on that slightly, and that's just that, I know that like Father Saffron Rose in his Russia's Catacomb Saints talks about stuff like that. But if ROCOR recognized that anathema against Sergianism, we would be saying it on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and we never did.
And indeed, we condemn ecumenism during those anathemas.
Right.
But let me just go with this, being that, again, it's part of the ROCOR polemic. I'm not even judging how official it is. But this is definitely something that it's cited in this true Orthodox document as authoritative. So let's go by the definition of Sergianism that this document that they accept as authoritative states. The heresy of Sergianism is those who teach that the earthly existence of the Church of God can be based upon the denial of the truth. Again, those who teach, right? Not what they do precisely. They teach that the earthly existence of the Church of God can be based upon the denial of the truth of Christ and proclaim that serving God-hating authorities and being faithful to their atheistic commands, so they have to proclaim that that we have to serve God-hating authorities and be faithful through atheism. And I couldn't summarize it in very few words. It also says we can't break the canons. So that's the definition of Sergianism given by this council. So what's it condemn? It condemns modernism, renovationism. It condemns overturning canonical precedent. It condemns positively teaching, right? It's not some sort of passive thing, proclaiming and teaching. Positively teaching that the Orthodox Church can, maybe that means must, I don't know Russian, be based upon the denial of the truth of Christ and endorsing atheist authority and atheism. All right? And so by this definition of Sergianism, ROCOR and the Moscow, nor the Moscow Patriarchate today does this. No one is endorsing Sergianism. I'm going to share screen real quick with the 2000 synodical statement from Moscow. So you can say, does Moscow denounce this definition of Sergianism? You'll get to see now with your own eyes. All right, so this is a synodical statement from the Moscow Patriarchate. All right, I got to move. Maybe I made it a little too big. I'll make it a little smaller. Make it easy. It says, the church remains loyal to the state, but the commandment to fulfill the task of salvation in any situation and under any circumstances above this loyalty. If the authority forces Orthodox believers to apostatize from Christ and his church and to commit sinful and spiritually harmful actions, the church should refuse to obey the state. The Christian found the will of his conscience can refuse to fulfill the command state, force him into a grave sin. If the church and her holy authorities find it impossible to obey state laws and orders, and after due consideration of the problem, they may take the following action: enter direct dialogue with the authority on the problem, call upon the people to use democratic mechanisms to change the legislation or review the authority's decision, apply to international bodies and the world of public opinion, and appeal to our faithful for peaceful civil disobedience. All right, and so I won't belabor that longer, and I'll go back to the PowerPoint here. What we can see is denouncing that they have to endorse atheistic authority. Anything against Christ, they're supposed to reject. That's what the official MP statement on it, and it gets more and more detailed. There's other nuances. It's very, very long. But the point is, ROCOR nor MP since 2000 endorses Sergianism. And it's really slander to say that they're Sergianist, because the actual official statement, not Patriarch Kirill, this fancy little statue somewhere and stuff like that. But we have an official synodical statement that shows that it does not endorse what this synod in 1937 condemns. So that is my point. Now, the synod, this True Orthodox Synod in 2014, gives people a definition of neo-Sergianism, which is a heresy that only exists in this statement. It's not something that's part of ROCOR's history. Neo-Sergianism is a worldly spirit, unscrupulousness, deception, and a pathological servility towards the powerful of this world, now no longer for fear of reprisals from atheistic rulers, but for the sake of self-serving and secularist motives, peddling the freedom of the church in exchange for gaining friendship with the world and with the powerful of this world. All right, and so I think anyone reading this impartially would see this is way too broad a definition of heresy. It's like being friendly to rich and powerful people equals heresy.
Well, and besides
this is
that,
way too broad a definition of heresy.
How would the church under the Ottoman Turks not fall under that definition? Because they certainly were cooperating with a government that was persecuting the church. They levied taxes on their people to bribe the Sultan every time they needed to elect a new patriarch, which was a violation of the canons against simony. But you know what? No one in the church condemned Constantinople at that time, because they understood, hey, they're in a bad situation. They wouldn't be doing this if they had the freedom not to. But were they cooperating with a God-hating government that was persecuting the church? They certainly were. I mean, there's not much left of the Christian population of Turkey. and in the Middle East. And now, obviously, at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Turks collapsed and the modern state of Turkey arose, there were more Christians then than there are now, but it was still dramatically reduced from what it had been, because the church was in this situation not by choice, and the Turks used various means to put pressure on the people to convert to Islam, and gradually a lot of people caved.
You know, it's whether it's Peter the Great, whether it's the Old Believers and what happened with them, whether it's, again, the Ottoman Turks, Byzantine history. If we don't view Orthodoxy as preserved despite overt and integrated political influence over the centuries, it's game over. It's not good enough to say, oh, you're just repeating an old Moscow patriarch polemic. Because, yes, a broken clock could be right twice a day. That doesn't mean when it says 12 o'clock, it's wrong. It could actually be 12 o'clock. So the basic fact is, if we subscribe to this view of neo-Sergianism, it's game over. There's no point in us even talking about Orthodoxy being preserved for 2,000 years by anyone. It's already game over. It's a ridiculous and overly broad. There's this romantic symphonia view versus reality, and the reality is the state illegalized and persecuted heresies. It sometimes gave major oomph and impetus behind the church to do things. Canon law was civil law, so there was, I don't think you get much more integrated than that with the church and the government and the rich and powerful. And so it kind of begs the question, is it symphonia when the doctrines are correct, but neo-Sergianism when they're wrong? And so essentially neo-Sergianism becomes this kind of dark foil where you're actually taking something that Orthodox take as orthodox, symphonia. You're saying, no, it's a kind of heresy. Yeah, obviously you can't have symphonia with evil things. We're not espousing that, but it's not a heresy, right? Symphonia is not a heresy. And so neo-Sergianism is just this sort of, it's not repeatable. And if it's not repeatable, it's not a true idea that you could actually identify as a heresy. Now, I think that 2014's definition of Sergianism lacks 1937's precision, because, right, the 1937 statement says that it's taught, it's proclaimed, and it includes atheism being proclaimed. These are very specific things that are very, very wrong, which all of us universally condemn. But 2014 lacks this. It's much broader because, right, you got to be broader to condemn ROCOR and to condemn the Moscow Patriarchate these days, because no one is guilty of the more specific definition. But the more specific definition is repeatable. It's identifiable. I would say it's right. Right? I go, you know what? I will concede to you 1937 Uskud. But the point is, what you consider Sergianism now is not what that synod declares. And that is the problem. So anyway, all of these so-called official churches, the True Orthodox statement continues, have now joined decisively, unwaveringly, unrepentantly in the process of syncretistic apostasy of a Sergianist and ecumenist kind, an anti-ecclesiastical and uncanonical process synodally promoted or permitted by their hierarchies. All right, so again, an uncanonical process promoted or permitted. So you're equally guilty because you're not fighting this and breaking communion with them. False teachers cannot have any prayerful, mysteriological, or administrative communion. So simply permitting others to be ecumenist or neo-Sergianists invalidates ecclesiastical hierarchies and sacramental grace. And we think that's just obviously too far. This is, and why? Because it's worse than Donatism. The Donatists broke communion with those who are apostates and those in communion with apostates. And they were wrong to do that. And they were wrong. But at least they were apostates. Imagine someone saying, oh, you're neo-Sergianist and you now lack grace, so we break communion with you.
Well, it was people that they accused of being apostates, but who denied it. And the thing is, to my knowledge, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know that there was a synodal affirmation that the bishop in question actually wasn't a traditor or that he wasn't guilty. It just simply said that you can't declare the sacraments of a bishop, even if it was true, to be without grace, as long as he's acting on behalf of the church, and so they are falling into the same heresy, or worse.
And the ban said understandable reasons, but again, you could have right reasons, but still end up on the wrong side of something. I also think that this sort of view of intra-Orthodox exclusivism contradicts a tangential communion with the Serbians in Jerusalem that existed in the 1990s by everyone's account, right? The Greek true Orthodox using Jerusalem's antimons, the ROCOR priests like yourselves being blessed by your bishop to serve the Serbians, attending where there's multiple bishops and stuff, glorification, St. John, where they're allowing clergy from the world Orthodox jurisdictions. This is where, and with all due respect, the sort of reinvention that ROCOR is totally walled off from all world Orthodox, again, against what everyone recollects, what everyone was doing, is a sort of reinvention of history. All right? And it's a reinvention of history with a very specific polemical end to justify that, yes, you could be completely cut off in the world Orthodox and somehow be canonically regular. But again, it's just not justifiable. It's not found in the history. So that aside, the joint TO statement continues. The Constitution, and we have this interesting comment, the true Orthodox served in Jerusalem until recently. So, all right, please list your sources. I'm very interested in that question.
And why are they not heretics that have been destroyed by the fact that they were in communion with people who were in communion with people who were heretics?
Because, again, we already know that's wrong. But that aside, the TO statement continues, the constitution and continuation of the local true Orthodox churches was ensured by hierarchs from among the innovators, new calendars joining them, following the confession of orthodoxy, of course, by the consecration of bishops by a true Orthodox ecclesiastical authority in the diaspora, having indisputable apostolic succession. Let me just go here. True Orthodox Church does not provide assurance concerning their validity or concerning their soteriological efficacy, meaning the holy orders of the world Orthodox. In particular, for those who commune knowingly with syncretistic ecumenism and Sergianism, even though she does not in every instant repeat their external form for those entering to communion with her in repentance. So meaning, like St. Philaret of New York said about the Moscow Patriarchate, that we will accept the form of their holy orders, but we don't accept that they have grace. That was his view. And I think if I remember right, Father, he said he doesn't believe it. He didn't say this is the view of everyone within his time.
He specifically said, I don't impose this view on anyone else, but that is my opinion. But his opinion was actually a little bit more nuanced than that, because he believed that there were people in the Moscow Patriarchate who were true believers, so he believed that they had grace.
And so that being said, because like I said, I think his issue is more intra-Russian, and the
Right.
true Orthodox converts project that there's these larger, more interjurisdictional ramifications, and that's going beyond what their actual, much more narrow concerns were, I think.
Right.
So that being said, in this response about how they receive people, and it's only because they have the form of ordinations, there's some implicit admission to canonical irregularity on their part, because they're already admitting, yep, our holy orders are made of people without grace, and the ROCOR pretty much coming in here and giving us bishops, which we already established, began in a canonically irregular way. Right? So there's this admission that the whole church originates from canonical irregularity, and there's just, we can't, don't mean in a mean way, and we'll see when we end. I'm really not trying to be mean about it. It's just reality. But it's worth pointing out that no movement that ever saved the whole church has been walled off from all the canonically regular churches as far as we know. Keyword, as far as we know. Diatheletism has a lot of unknowns, like we talked about. The synods were under caliphate persecution. They didn't get to regularly elect patriarchs during those days. So it's somewhat unclear. But as far as we know, that's never occurred. All right? And that's important to point out. This would be totally unprecedented. It would be an innovation, in fact, because it's never occurred before. Now, true Orthodoxy hinges on ROCOR ordinations, but the former, as we pointed out, recognized the World Orthodox ordinations in those churches. They even excommunicated the Greek old calendars over that question. And they reconciled with them when that question was being resolved. Now, we see
another interesting thing is Subdeacon Notarius Harrison's book on the relationship between ROCOR and the old calendarists, interestingly, provides positive proof that Metropolitan Anthony Kropovitsky and Metropolitan Anastasi never believed that we should go into communion with the Greek old calendarists. And so you can't say that this is that this is old ROCOR was all agreeing with Metropolitan Filaret when old ROCOR manifestly did not agree with that. And there was crazy stuff going on in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, and 60s, while those two metropolitans were, running ROCOR. But Metropolitan Anthony Kropovitsky opposed the new calendar. He thought that it was a grave mistake, but he admonished an Athonite monk that was writing him that it was wrong for him to stop commemorating his patriarch.
We also have the statement from letter 250 of St. Seraphim Rose, where he says, our church as a whole, and certainly almost all bishops and priests apart from the Boston wing. So again, repeat, certainly, right? So see, he's pretty sure of this. Almost all bishops and priests does not believe Moscow and new calendars to be without grace. Those who wish to believe this as their personal opinion are not persecuted for it, but they certainly cannot make such an opinion obligatory on others.
That's a great quote, and that's positive proof that when people say old ROCOR was like Metropolitan Filaret, that's just not the case. You've got St. Seraphim verifying this for us. And that was always my impression when I was in ROCOR from the very beginning, was that this was the view of most people and that the other view was a fringe view. And I think a case can be made, and I think it's probably true, that the extreme opinions in ROCOR were largely the result of the what became the Hockness-ism or the Panalamonites being in ROCOR from sometime around like 1969 or something. They had a very poisonous effect, and Father Seraphim Rose adamantly opposed them. At first, he had cordial correspondences with them, but it became very clear to him that they were extreme, and he wrote against their mentality frequently.
And it's just worth pointing out, 90%, maybe more, of ROCOR went to Unimasca Patriarchate. It's probably that, again, that almost all, that proportion of people that never bought into World Orthodox, totally void of grace, totally got the cooties, right? It's not out of nowhere that 90% went to communion, right? They always had some sort of intellectual precedent that made that possible. And we'll get a little more to that in a little later. But that being said, I read the book. It's not too long. It's The Grace of God Present in the Soviet Church. It's pretty much about true Orthodox exclusivism. I'll call him Blessed Ivan Andreyev. I can't pronounce it.
I believe.
He's a confessor of the faith. He appears to have had some feeling of some experience, rather, of theosis. So I will call him Blessed. And so he published the books, translated to English on this question.
He was a professor at Jordanville for many years, if I remember correctly.
Yes, into the 70s. So I think from the 40s to the 70s. And his grave is still there. Probably walk past it all the time, and I can't read Russian, so I don't know who it is. But that being said, he says a couple statements I think are helpful for us on this question. And it is, he says this: the patriarch, which he puts in quotation marks, Alexei, was acknowledged by all Eastern patriarchs. But even if Paul, Eastern patriarchs acknowledge falsehood for truth. The falsehood would not thereby become truth. So there's a few things going on here. All right. We see some circular reasoning to extent like, yes, I agree. You can't, with everyone agreeing, make something false true. But then what is our way of discerning the truth other than just like, right, open up all the history books, right? There'd be the consensus of something determines a question. The faith held everywhere by consented to by all, like St. Vincent de Lorenz says, right? There was a Vincentian canon on this and a consensus-based ecclesiology, right? So if all the patriarchs during a problem recognize that, yes, this person is an actual bishop, this does show that the consensus of the church recognizes that there's grace there. Doesn't mean they didn't endorse everything Patriarch Alexei did. They didn't condemn the Uskut Council. There's lots of things they didn't do, but they recognized Patriarch Alexei. And so in order to argue that all the world's patriarchs, as Blessed Ivan admits, are wrong, you start running into the sort of issues where you start taking apart historical Orthodox ecclesiology, which is what I've studied. It has to do with our apologetics against Roman Catholicism, right? How do I identify the magisterium of the church if it's not for the consensus of the whole church? That's what we read about in Acts 15. So this is an issue I absolutely cannot budge on. So yes, we need antiquity. It can't be just like everyone in the present believing something, but we have to believe if everyone in the present consents to something that's wrong, then the gates of hell will prevail against the church. And we can't believe that to be possible and hold that the Orthodox Church has the truth. So what we see the true Orthodox unwittingly doing is undercutting the witness of the Orthodox Church and opening up the Orthodox Church to accusations that they've fallen into categorical error. But the weird thing is, on top of this, is Blessed Ivan recognizes all these other Eastern patriarchs because, right, this is the 40s. There was no polemic at this point that the whole world Orthodox Church has got the cooties and they're not the church. He recognizes them as actual patriarchs. So here's this book that is cited that, look, this proves that the grace of God is not present in the Moscow Patriarchate because, again, that was the polemic of St. Philaret. That is the polemic of Blessed Ivan. They don't believe that that church had grace. But even they, whose witness the modern true Orthodox depend upon to prove, right, that the world Orthodox lack grace, they're not the church, did not believe what the world or the true Orthodox believe today about that. And I think this is a passage that shows that to be the case. Now, there's another passage that stuck out to me. Which is this, that the whole fullness of unspeakable spiritual beauty of the invisible, secret Russian Catacomb Church will become obvious to the world only then, when the God-fighting Soviet government and the Soviet Church, spiritually enslaved by them, will disappear. So this is, for one, he's saying when the Soviet Union's gone, the real church will be there for everyone to see. All right, so just take, like Father John was saying, here's someone who was teaching at Jordanville for decades. All right. So all these clergy coming out of Jordanville between the 40s and the 70s are going to be imbibing in ideas like these. And what this quote doesn't show, but if you read the surrounding pages, the polemic is that the Catacomb Church, though in the shadows, actually outnumbers. It's bigger than the Moscow Patriarchate Church. All right. That the fake Moscow Patriarchate Church is just a paper church. It has fake KGB bishops. It doesn't have real believers. And this will be clear to everyone once the Iron Curtain falls, and then the Russian Catacomb Church is obvious for all to see. Now,
and this actually is another issue that my views did change at a certain point, but it was long before Metropolitan Vitali's time ended in ROCOR. There was Joseph McClellan. He was a pious layman, but then later an archimandrite, and he became the head of the ecclesiastical mission in the Holy Land. Very well educated, brother-in-law of Father George Loris, by the way, and I remember making some kind of statement about the Catacomb Church and him saying, "Look, the Catacomb Church," and he was a historian. The Catacomb Church really, for the most part, ceased to exist after Patriarch Alexei's election. Well, Ivan Andreev, he wasn't there for that. He was out of the Soviet Union by the time World War II was over. And there were a lot of people in ROCOR like that. They remembered the Soviet Union of the 1930s. And so they assumed that reality was still the way that it was, but it's just not the reality. What happened with the Catacomb Church was it was like, if you take a balloon and you squeeze one side, the other side gets bigger. And then when you squeeze the other side, this side gets bigger. Well, when the Soviets went after the Catacomb Church, when they went after the above ground church, the Catacomb Church would balloon. But then when they would let go of it and relax things a little bit, and churches were allowed to reopen, people started going back to the churches that were open. And when Patriarch Alexei was elected, most people recognized it as a legitimate election, including St. John. He never, despite what people want to say, he never later said, I was wrong. He was not really legitimately elected. He just simply was obedient to the synod that he had pledged obedience to, which was ROCOR.
Now, this being said, a lot of the people, I would say the children of the whites, meaning, the Russian immigrants and the children of those who escaped Russian as refugees because they were persecuted, and those who escaped with the Germans, eventually left Germany and got to America. So, right, the ethnic body of ROCOR, right? Like, that's what ROCOR started with, especially in the United States, right? Those people and their children would visit the USSR. I spoke to one of these individuals. I'll be vague just, because she's not asking to be part of the show in any way. And so eventually they're able to get visas to go and travel visas to the USSR, and they bring icons and, of course, Jordanville material and stuff to, the love bomb, the USSR, because they were evangelizing the fake MP church. They're under the impression that, like, it was all a facade, because this is everything you're brought up believing. It was just all a facade. These are not real churches, not real faithful believers. And the USSR did themselves no favors because they would assign spies to go after these people. So, like, this person recalls that this Armenian came up to her, because it's the USSR, and Armenians, of course, speak Russian, and, strike up a conversation and start, oh, you're going to church? I'll go to church with you. And, it becomes pretty obvious this person's your spy. It's like in Rocky IV, where the guys in the Mercedes follow Rocky wherever he trains. This person follows you wherever you go because you're this subversive element. And so that just feeds into the paranoia that everything's fake. It's like the Truman Show of churches, pretty much. And so, again,
there's a proto-deacon that I know that told me when he visited the Soviet Union in the 70s that he had some minder that was following him everywhere he went.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, he went to an ice cream stand and got 2 ice cream cones, and he held one behind his back, and then the minder came and took it.
Yeah,
so this was standard. This was standard routine during the Soviet period. But and the thing is, Ivan Andreev, he suffered. He was a confessor of the faith, and he suffered through some very horrendous times before he was able to exit the Soviet Union. And so he did not have a dispassionate view of the players. And a lot of these people, they blamed the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate because they saw them as, defending the Soviet Union. And I think it's understandable that some people would view things that way. When you've seen people suffer and you see these people who you think are going along with the Soviets, and you don't realize that they're suffering too. Because the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate didn't get a free ride. Many of them wound up being killed. As a matter of fact, there was Metropolitan Joseph of Petrograd that Father Joseph Swaden's named for, and he likes to complain that the Moscow Patriarchate is not recognized. And well, I'm the editor of the St. Innocent Liturgical Calendar, and I can tell you that the Jordanville calendar has him on there, as does the St. Innocent calendar. So, and we commemorate him out loud in our services. But anyway, when he was martyred along with St. Cyril of Kazan, and I believe it was like a higher martyr Eugene or something like that. But they were shot together. And those 3 bishops basically represented 3 factions. One was the Metropolitan Sergius is a traitor, faction. One was under Metropolitan Sergius, and then you had St. Cyril of Kazan that took the middle ground and said, Sergius is wrong, but I'm not going to condemn him. And they were all shot together. And I remember reading somewhere that they blessed each other as they were about ready to be shot. I wish I knew where that was recorded, because I would love to be able to point people to the source. But I think that in their deaths they were united.
Now remember, like Blessed Yvonne is saying, once the Iron Curtain falls, we'll all see, this catacomb church, and we'll see how fake the other church is. But
that's not what happened.
People in ROCOR who visit the USSR are under this idea, right? That it's a Truman Show church over there. So there's that imagination versus reality. Now they're already Alexander Solzhenitsyn, however you pronounce his name, he called it a pious dream.
Solzhenitsyn.
As far as I know, St. Philard in New York said, no, you're wrong. There's definitely catacomb bishops and all that. So Iron Curtain falls, ROCOR returned to Russia in the 1990s. There was not this huge catacomb church entered a communion with, right? It was something that, as you said with the balloon, it's just people, when they couldn't worship freely as Orthodox, they had to do it underground.
Well, what's interesting is
it's like during COVID, and when they're able to go to church like normal, they went to church like normal. It's not that complicated.
Under Metropolitan Vitali, ROCOR did not recognize the legitimacy of any old calendar bishop. A catacomb bishop. So they did secretly consecrate some bishops for the catacomb church as they understood it, but they didn't recognize there being any catacomb bishops left. And so I think that's something that that's a reality that you have to deal with. Is they thought that there was this big group of catacomnics that were still around, and there probably were some, but they just were not very numerous. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you can't accuse him of being an apologist for the Soviet Union, because he did more to let the people in the West know about the horrors of the Soviet gulags than anybody else.
So my point is, imagine growing up, you've heard about your parents, your grandparents' persecutions, and you have no reason to doubt it. You go back, you're being spied on and everything, so it all just seems like a big old facade. So it's everything you know, right? It's going along with it. And then you realize it's not true. It's like that's a major bubble popping. It's like finding Santa Claus isn't real. And so my guess, because again, I was alive at the time, but I was not Orthodox. I was a kid in the 90s, right? So my guess is this led to a reevaluation. When I speak to, again, the people that were ROCOR for decades, their whole life, all right? When I speak to people that have been in ROCOR their whole lives, essentially, it was like they tell the story like how it unfolds here, and then there's essentially saying, but then people come back from Russia in recent times, and people are faithful. They're going to church. They're doing feast days. It's not this big facade. They're Christians like we're Christians. And that led to a sort of a painful, but a sort of agreeable attitude to go, all right, we accept they're a church. We don't have reason not to be communion with anymore. And so here are my tentative conclusions. I say tentative because I have not done a super careful study. I do not put myself up as this expert on the issue. But my tentative conclusions are that true Orthodoxy changed its ethos from the 30s to 60s. I mean, clearly did. They recognized the World Orthodox churches as legitimate churches and whatnot. But ROCOR's ethos changed as well, right? As we just said, ROCOR's ethos was developed and created by all these refugees of people persecuted by the Soviets, right? So, yeah, that changes too, especially with a lot of the reality on the ground changing from what it was in the 30s and 20s and 40s and even a little bit in the 60s.
I would say, though, it's important to just recognize that there was... Can
I just finish one point?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
But my argument is ROCOR seems to have more continuity with the 30s and 60s than the true Orthodox have themselves in the 30s and 60s. Because at the end of the day, ROCOR now recognizes the World Orthodox churches like ROCOR then recognized World Orthodox churches. right? The real difference is just the recognition of what exactly was going on in Russia. And from all intents and purposes, what Blessed Ivan was looking to be vindicated with actually didn't occur. So it's people holding on to the reality of something that manifestly was not true, I think actually does violence to some saints like his memory. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that, Father. Let me give you the floor.
I think if you talked about sort of a change in ROCOR, I would say certainly today in ROCOR, you're not going to find anyone who says the Moscow Patriarchate has no grace because we're commemorating the Patriarch. And there were people that had that view back then, but that the Russian Church abroad never officially said the Moscow Patriarchate has no grace. That never happened. And I defy anybody to produce the synodal decree that says that they said any such thing. They certainly were critical. But the thing is, when we started talking to people from inside Russia, after beginning when the dialogue really started under Metropolitan Loras, and for example, I encourage everybody to read Everyday Saints by Metropolitan Tikhon Shevchenov, because in that book you're given a perspective from what did people who were actually inside Russia from starting from around World War II and up until the present time, how did they deal with the situations that they were in? And I think that we certainly did come to have a little bit more sympathy for those people. And again, I go back to Father George Lauren. What he said, I didn't agree with what he said at the time about the Moscow Patriarchate, but his attitude, if we were in their position, we would have done worse. That is a true Orthodox position on these things, because it's easy for us, and particularly, all these online true Orthodox folks that want to pontificate about this stuff. I mean, most of these people are not even old enough to remember when the Soviet Union was around, and they might have been born long after it ceased to exist. So it's easy for us to sit back and say, well, those dirty dogs should have done this. They should have been prepared to be, martyred rather than to make any kind of compromise with those dirty dogs. So, well, it's easy to say that, but if you were in that situation, you might not have done that. You might have done even worse than those people did. So maybe it's not such a good idea to judge harshly people that have been in situations that you haven't been in. Someone like Ivan Andreev, he actually was in situations like that, so they would have a little bit more credibility.
Oh yeah, someone like him walks the room, you shut up and you listen.
Right.
To kind of finish up my notes, I'm going to make another apology, because of course, what I just unfolded is going to proceed as protracted attack upon true Orthodoxy, which again really was a defense of why like the video is titled, why I'm not true Orthodox, why we're not true Orthodox. Now, I just want to say I'm very much open to correction. I'm probably simplifying things. Honestly, without getting sucked into a whirlpool of anti-Orthodox despair, I think the proceeding is fair with the details. I didn't do a PhD dissertation this stuff, but it's not that I'm distorting details here. I do think any true Orthodox reply to this should not focus on attacking my person, but it needs to address the first millennium and tangential communion, not pretend this stuff didn't exist. Right? Because it's all about how bad I am, supposedly, and how all this other stuff didn't exist. Then you just conceded everything, because it shows you can't address the facts. So I feel that's where positive dialogue could move forward. Now, I want to end this kind of my statements before we do audience questions with an olive branch. And my olive branch is, the true Orthodox can still be right. Now, Father John might not agree with this, but I want to take a teaching from history, and for the sake of our own humility and salvation, the true Orthodox can still be right. Why? Well, let's look at the examples of Saints Maximus and Martin of Rome. Both died outside the regular canonical boundaries of the church. St. Martin was deposed. St. Maximus was deposed. They supported canonically irregular ecclesiastical programs due to the end of the world. Right? So it's like, they were supporters of these canonically irregular churches of their day. They were not mentioned once by the Sixth Ecumenical Council, neither one. And that's why, by the way, because why would all these canonical churches who have to deal with all these broken pieces from the work of these men going to be very happy about what they did when that's all in very recent memory? So when endorsing their doctrine, they never endorsed the men. Yet these are the chief saints and the heroes of this era. These saints who are on the outs, even in the ecumenical council, aren't mentioned, are vindicated by history and by our veneration. So I want to caution everyone to judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, as the scripture says, that there's going to be saints ultimately on both sides of this question. I don't know how long. I don't know if there's true Orthodox saints today. It's not for me to judge. But because we know of things like this occurring in the past, we need to take a step back and be careful not to condemn someone who's on the right side of something when there is a canonical irregularity that separates them from us. Because again, we were in communion 20 years ago. We're not talking about ancient history. And God willing, there will be reconciliation 20 years from now. So those are my comments, Father. Before we do audience questions, let me give you some time for yours.
What I would say is, I think that ROCOR consistently wanted the old calendarists to take a moderate position when it came to their attitude towards the other churches. And even though I think that ROCOR's involvement with the old calendarists was largely a mistake, I think that I can understand why they did it at the time under the circumstances that they did. But the problem with these folks now is that not very many of them take that moderate view. Most of them take the extreme view. Everybody's a bunch of heretics. They're all graceless. And to me, they seem a lot more like the Donatists than they do like St. Maximus the Confessor. Because St. Maximus the Confessor actually was not the last of the Mohicans like he's often portrayed as being. He went to Rome and participated in a council that condemned the heresy that he was fighting. So he was keeping faith with a big chunk of the church that was standing firm for the truth. But he was not going to commune with people who were standing in defense of the error. But when you get to the point where you're saying everybody else is without grace, and particularly when you're divided into all these factions, and they'll point to church history and they'll say, well, look, during the Arian controversy, blah, 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 there were lots of groups. These groups are operating in freedom. Even in Greece, the old calendarists are not overtly persecuted by the state at this point. So they can't blame their divisions on, persecution. Their divisions are the result of individuals that can't get along with each other. And that's not a testimony to the grace of the Holy Spirit being at work, at least in a predominant way. Now, on the other hand, I'm not going to condemn people in these groups because, I think that's something that we'd have to have a canonical synodal verdict on the subject. I think, the Church of Greece at some point maybe could issue some kind of a judgment. But I think if they were going to be fair, though, they'd want to invite the people that they're getting ready to condemn to give an accounting of themselves or something like that.
Like in councils, they sometimes take a letter from whomever and then they read it out and then they endorse it and it becomes a doctrinal statement. Our response to the 2014 statement is going to be that in that council.
So just to sum things up, because we're getting close to the 3-hour mark here.
Yes.
I, in good conscience, would not want to be part of one of these groups just because I would have doubts about my status and relationship with the rest of the church. And so the people that want to say that I'm somehow, I know better, but I've given in, it's not like, the Russian Church abroad is a place to go and get rich if you're a clergyman. So, the idea that there's some Luke Oil stock shares coming my way, if somebody wants to send them to me, I'll give you my address, but it's not been coming my way. And I'm in my position is my position from my conscience. And I don't think that it's safe for people to go into these groups when they can't even get along with each other. Now, if they actually got together, and it's good that there has been some movement towards them uniting, because maybe if they all did get on the same page and presented a united front, maybe they would be able to put more pressure on churches like the Church of Greece to do the right thing when it comes to the calendar. But it's hard for people to take seriously a group that you can't keep track of because their acronyms keep changing.
It's before we do audience questions, I just want to tell people, please subscribe to Father John's channel. He needs like 15 more subscriptions. Stop what you're doing. Do it now. Go to Father John's channel, subscribe so they can use the cell phone stuff, do the live streams. Just make stuff their life a little easier. So please subscribe. Be the reason why St. Jonas Church could go to the next level. Also, if this has blessed you, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate to support the mission in Cambodia. Just very important. We need financial donors. We're buying prayer books. Are people there? Yes, because people read English. And that's why you should mind your Twitter comments and stuff, because people we are evangelizing do read polemics and all this stuff in English. And if we don't act as Christians, you will turn people away from the faith. And I wouldn't want that in your conscience. So please support the Orthodox Mission Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Link is below as well. Also, like, subscribe, and share this video. Now, because, Father, we've gone so long, let's really try to do rapid fire questions on these things. So I might be flip with your answer, but it's just so we could try to cover everything. Are schismatics considered in-house? And the answer is no, but the question would be whether or not these schismatics have tangential communion with someone else in the church, whether they could be reconciled like the Macedonians, who were walled off from the entirety of the church. And so they should not have too simplistic of understanding. If GOCK were to repent from some of those things in their 2014 statement 10 years from now, there'd be no reason to not be able to bring them all back in. So it's, and if there's a saint amongst that communion, just like, let's say St. Martin, who was cut off from the Roman Synod when he died, that person could be a saint we all end up recognizing. And so this wouldn't be an example of someone saying something along the lines of, this is someone completely outside the church that was a saint. These are examples, like we already talked about, of synods and resistance, things that did exist in the first millennium church, though not very often. It's not a normal nor regular thing. We have, do true Orthodox accept World Orthodox baptisms? Generally not. They tend to accept ROCOR. Depends on the body. So I don't know if there's much more to say. It's much as I know, because again, I'm not true Orthodox, so I don't really have an answer for that. Can I say that I think true Orthodox all believers to be actually Orthodox, although they are sick members of the body? Again, that we leave to the canonist, those sort of questions exactly, but they're where they stand, but they're definitely canonically irregular, and they're not communion with the world body of churches. We have, is Saint Glicity of Romania still a saint in ROCOR MP, or did the MP make you all cancel him? Do you know, Father John? I don't think they made us cancel any local canonizations that I'm aware of.
He's still listed as a saint in the Jordanville calendar. I was actually thinking today, in anticipation of this discussion, that there's actually a few saints on the calendar, the Jordanville calendar, that I have questions about, and I was going to ask for a blessing to write the Metropolitan on the subject, because I'm not sure if our Synod of Bishops has even addressed it.
No,
but
I'd be interested in the answer to that.
Yeah.
The Father Ambrose says God created not only the sun for the Gregorian calendar, but also moon and stars to glorify him. Not sure if that's to justify continuation of the Gregorian calendar, which I don't think so.
By the way, before we move on, if people are wondering what other saints I'm talking about, I'll give you one example, and that's the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire is listed as a saint in the Jordanville calendar. I've not listed him in the Saint Innocent calendar because, to my knowledge, he was a Uniate.
Probably.
And I know that I think the Greeks did put him on their calendar, and I think what Jordanville tends to do is put people on the calendar if they see another local church.
That's exactly what they do, because Kyler Karras is in Jordanville's calendar.
But what I don't know, that's also true, and that's another one that I want to ask about.
Well, remember, you were there. We asked Felica Peter. He was like, I'm not aware of this.
But I haven't gotten any kind of clarification. What I would like to know is does the Synod of Bishops actually have an official list of saints, or is Jordanville just the unofficial list, and that's as close as we're going to get? But these are things I would like to clarify.
Oh,
but the thing is, what I won't say that Saint Glakiri is roasting in hell, like some people in the TOC would say about Saint Paisius. And Saint Paisius is just he's such a manifest saint. If you read his life, you read people who knew him, you read the miracles, you read his prophecies. I don't know how anybody could take that position, but they have to, because he doesn't fit within their cooties view of the church.
It's a shame. He was on the old calendar when he was in Athos.
Yep.
Were there multiple calendars in the early church? And the answer is essentially yes, but they're always trying to hash out to get the right one, because math was hard back then. They didn't have calculators.
Well, there were two calendars in the early church. The Egyptian calendar was effectively parallel to the Julian calendar, but there are some slight differences. So I wouldn't say it's exactly the same.
And they'd have to, sometimes they would calculate like Pascha on a different day, but it's only because the calculations were off and stuff like that.
And it's the Paschalian that was the big controversy, and it was more so because you had people who had the practice of celebrating Pascha on the actual day of Passover.
That's right, and even that was tolerated for a time.
Yeah, it was something that went on for a long time, and then I think there was another version, another Paschalian that was going on in Great Britain when the Synod of Whitby happened, and it wasn't exactly the same as the people who did it on Passover itself, but it was like 1 week off typically from the calendar that the rest of the church was using. It, like I said, took centuries for them to get unity on this question.
Right, trying to be quick here, guys, so we apologize in advance. There was a miraculous cross in the sky, which appeared on an old calendar holiday, and that's big in ROCOR. Why does Patriarch Kirill call Metropolitan Sergius a confessor? I don't know.
I think it's because he feels like he needs to defend him because he thinks that he's been caricaturized, but he has his opinion. I don't think that you're going to see.
We don't believe in infallible popes, infallible patriarchs. Yeah,
and you're not going to see him glorified as a saint. I don't believe, because I think that might actually cause a schism in the Russian church.
What does Blessed Father Sephiroth say about Metropolitan Sergius? I don't know. Do you know, Father?
Well, if you read through his letters, which actually are available online, and one of the cool things about that is you can actually do a Control F and search for names and stuff.
Mention.
But I don't think that he was certainly very critical of Metropolitan Sergius. I don't think that he made a judgment over him, because I think if you asked him, he probably would have said, well, that's God's department. That's not mine.
God Save Us says, I know clergy of the Greek Old Calendarist who met St. Paisos and has an icon. So that's good. Like I said, that's why I'm not going to write off everyone within the Greek Old Calendarist. We don't judge for the time. When I first started attending Orthodox churches, the convert mix was more balanced, close to 50% men, 50% women. There's obviously, since COVID, been this sort of very male-dominated conversion ratio. And a lot of it's because of apologetics, which doesn't really attract women. So we're really going to have to address that somehow. Don't ask the apologist. It's like asking, the bartender, what do we do about people that are alcoholics? Like, listen, my job is to serve people beer. That's not my purview. Had Saint Gennadios even had any sort of glorification in the true Orthodox? And the answer is no, because he only was fairly recently glorified by the Greek Church. Is schism and heresy the same sin? No, the schisms often happen because of heresy. Schism occurs when you break communion, and heresy is teaching a false doctrine. So they're different sins. We don't commune with monophysites. The people in Craig's channel even watch his videos, and that was like, it came up even with Father Joseph. It's like, wait, you were in the video. You were in the video where it came out there was no communion between the monophysites and the Eastern Orthodox. So it's crazy. What about when the state sends people to an unjust war? Meaning like, what's the church do? Generally speaking, I don't think the church historically has ever been really obstinate in things about war. It always prays for peace. There's canons where you can't commune if you serve in a war for a certain amount of years. I don't know how strict they are with those canons. So the church never, ever endorses war, the shedding of blood. But it's, and we have saints in ROCOR that stood up against, let's say, the Nazis and stuff like that. So it's, again, we don't endorse unjust wars, but Orthodoxy also doesn't oppose the state's right to conscript people for war. Can we pray someone out of hell? Well, out of Hades, the answer is yes. That's a nice, quick answer. What is the proof that Metropolitan Sergius destroyed churches and had people killed? I'm not aware of it. It's just an accusation that exists.
It's an accusation, and I would like to see the evidence.
It exists in the polemics, and yeah. But and the evidence shouldn't be a very, a feminine strategy is like, how dare you not believe this bad evidence, right? Like, you're this horrible human being if you don't believe this bad. It's like, listen, I might be a horrible human being, but if you want to make me a better human being, present good, unfalsifiable evidence, which everyone agrees is good evidence. Right? If I tell you 9 times 7 is 63 because I say so, that might not be very good evidence, even if I'm right? So you might want good evidence to demonstrate a principle. I've heard it said that St. John commemorated the patriarch in the Proskomedia. What do you know about this?
Well, there are two bishops that say the same thing about that. One was Archbishop Anthony of Geneva, and the other one was Bishop Basil or Archbishop Basil Radzianka, who was the OCA eventually, but I think he was in ROCOR, and he gave a sermon about St. John, I think before his glorification, and talked about this, that basically he found himself outside of Yugoslavia, and he asked St. John about coming into ROCOR, but he told St. John, if coming into ROCOR means I have to cast stones at the Russian church, the Moscow Patriarchate specifically, I'm not going to do it. And St. John said, no, you don't have to do that. You can serve with any canonical church that you want to. And he also said, I commemorate Patriarch Alexei at every proscomedia. He's our patriarch, even though right now we can't be under him, but he's the patriarch of the Russian church, is what he said. And since you have two separate bishops that say the same thing, I'd say there must be at least a basic truth there. It's
hearsay. Hearsay is admissible in things like administrative hearings. It's not a kind of proof that is never used legally. But again, there's stronger proof than hearsay, so it is what it is. We have Father Ambrose. That was an awesome research and response to schismatic true Orthodox. I'm just grateful for the compliment. There's a little dig there, but Father Ambrose is from Russia. And then we have, from what I heard, Bishop Luke has a good understanding of Metropolitan Demetrius. I don't know I can't tell you, but we should all strive to have good relationships and build bridges and reconcile. And where there's errors, like I do believe are in the 2014 True Orthodox Statement, those errors need to be corrected ultimately. There's one last question. We'll be real quick. When you guys say you could pray people out of Hades, you mean Christian sinners who didn't fully repent? Yes, them, though you could technically pray for anyone. because you don't know if an angel converted someone before they died. All the wacky exceptions that exist. You could pray for anyone.
Well, there are many accounts in the lives of the saints of people praying pagans out of Hades, including the Emperor Trajan, who actually persecuted the church. St. Gregory the Dialogist prayed for him.
Thecla, which is a very early one, which has that. So yeah, you can pray for anyone. There's nothing wrong with praying for anyone. So anyway, Father, we're way over 3 hours. It's been great having you on. I felt at least we got to go over a lot of stuff, which would be hard to do in a dialogue format, that quasi-debate-ish format, so to say, where there's both sides and both sides have to say, and you can't get too right in that format. I could, you or I or no one could get this much into it without making it too argumentative. So I'm grateful we had the opportunity to do that today. And Father, any last words?
Well, I do pray for reconciliation, and I think that it's certainly possible that if the ecumenical patriarchate does go into schism ultimately from the rest of the church, that it might open up the door to bringing these people back into full communion with the rest of the church. And I hope that happens. I think that we'd have much easier time bringing people into the church if that happened, and that's what I would like to see happen.
And definitely, I think what we would like ultimately is we'd like everyone to become Orthodox, but how much more of those that are actually Orthodox? Right? Those are the people we got to bring back in first.
Well, one other thing I'll say is that anybody who has seen me dialoguing with someone who's trying to defend like the ecumenical movement or anything like that, which I've done a few times over the years, I always say, why are you not talking to the old calendarist? You're spending all these times talking to Roman Catholics and Protestants. Why are you not talking to the old calendarist? Shouldn't you start there? So this is not something I'm just saying here, or this is something that I say when I'm talking to the folks that are on the opposite side of those questions.
And before I run, I want people, Father Ambrose is here. Support the mission in Granada. GranadaOrthodox.org. Again, GranadaOrthodox.org. If you're watching all these videos and supporting people financially and you're not supporting missionary work, you're doing this wrong, is all I can tell you. So GranadaOrthodox.org. Well, you know what, Father? Let's call it a night. I'm going to end this show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus Rock. Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.